Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I'm glad you're here. Settle into whatever place you've chosen for tonight, whether that is a bed, a couch, a chair by a window, or a room where everyone else has already gone quiet. We're going to spend some time in Miami, but not the Miami of travel advertisements, luxury towers, celebrity restaurants, and carefully edited photographs. We're going back to the years when the city became the main American gateway for a cocaine trade so profitable that traffickers could buy aircraft, boats, houses, businesses, weapons, loyalty, and sometimes silence. Before we begin, tell me something simple. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there? Miami is a city that changes character with the hour. In the morning, it can look practical and busy. In the afternoon, the heat slows everything down. At night, water, glass, headlights, and music make the city appear wealthier and more mysterious than it may really be. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, that difference between appearance and reality became unusually important. If this kind of careful historical storytelling helps you relax while still learning something real, you can like the video and subscribe to the channel. There's no need to interrupt what you're doing. Just remember it later, when the story has drawn you in. The phrase cocaine cowboys sounds as though it was invented for a television series. It suggests men in expensive shirts, speedboats crossing blue water, piles of cash, and gunmen behaving as if Miami belonged to them. Some of that image was real. Much of it was later exaggerated, rearranged, or polished into entertainment. The actual history was less neat. It involved immigrants and old residents, legitimate businesses and criminal fronts, federal agents and local police, bankers, pilots, fishermen, lawyers, mechanics, hotel workers, frightened witnesses, ambitious smugglers, and ordinary families who had no connection to the drug trade except that they lived in the city where it expanded. Miami did not suddenly become violent because one criminal organization arrived and introduced cocaine. The city was already changing at high speed. Its location made it a natural connection point between the United States, the Caribbean, and Latin America. South Florida had grown rapidly after the Second World War as roads, aviation, construction, tourism, and year-round migration expanded. History Miami describes the region as a gateway of the Americas, shaped by geography and by repeated waves of newcomers. That description is useful because a gateway can carry almost anything. It can carry tourists, refugees, investment, food, music, political ideas, legal trade, and illegal cargo. The same connections that help a city grow can also be used by people who do not intend to follow the law. To understand the Miami that traffickers entered, it helps to remove the later soundtrack and look at the city as it appeared around 1970. Miami Beach still had famous hotels and a powerful association with winter vacations, conventions, nightlife, and older visitors from the Northeast. Downtown Miami had banks, stores, offices, government buildings, bus stops, and aging commercial blocks. Biscayne Bay was full of ordinary maritime traffic, small airfields, private marinas, repair yards, warehouses, and canals were scattered across a region where boats and aircraft were normal equipment rather than suspicious objects. Beyond the most recognizable neighborhoods, the metropolitan area spread through Dade County in low buildings, shopping centers, subdivisions, industrial strips, and long roads designed around cars. The Everglades began not far to the west. The Florida Keys stretched south. The Bahamas were close enough to make regular crossings practical. Thousands of miles of coastline, islands, channels, and open water complicated surveillance. The Coast Guard later summarized the problem directly. South Florida's long, partly uninhabited coastline and its proximity to the Bahamas and South America made the area a prime target for drug importation. Those geographical advantages did not belong to criminals. Fishermen knew the water, private pilots knew the small airports, mechanics understood which boats could carry extra weight. Freight handlers knew how cargo moved through ports. Hotel employees knew which guests paid cash and asked few questions. Most of these people lived ordinary lives and never joined a smuggling operation. Yet the region contained a deep supply of useful knowledge, equipment, and transportation. A trafficker did not have to invent an underground city. He could rent, purchase, bribe, recruit, or hide within the legal one. Miami was also being transformed by migration from Cuba. After the Cuban Revolution, refugees began arriving in large numbers, and South Florida became the center of a new Cuban-American community. Some arrived with professional experience or business skills. Others arrived with almost nothing. Families were divided, careers were restarted, and neighborhoods changed language within a few years. Between 1960 and 1962, Operation Pedro Pan alone brought about 14,000 unaccompanied Cuban children to the United States, many through Miami. That episode was only one part of a much larger movement of people caused by revolution, political fear, family separation, and the belief that exile might be temporary. The community built businesses, newspapers, restaurants, factories, banks, churches, clinics, and political organizations. Spanish became part of daily public life in a way that changed Miami permanently. In 1973, Maurice Ferré became the city's first Hispanic mayor. In 1976, the Miami Herald began publishing El Herald as a Spanish-language supplement. In 1978, the first Calle Ocho festival drew more than 100,000 people to Little Havana. These were signs of a city developing a new identity, not merely replacing an old one. That history matters because later accounts sometimes speak carelessly about Cubans, Colombians, and other Latin American groups as though immigration itself produced the cocaine wars. It did not. Criminal networks used family ties, language, business contacts, and international travel. But the overwhelming majority of immigrants were building lawful lives under difficult conditions. Many had escaped governments that used surveillance, imprisonment, confiscation, and violence. They did not come to Miami to become supporting characters in somebody else's crime story. Still, a city that was expanding its trade with Latin America naturally produced more flights, more shipping, more money transfers, more visitors, and more commercial relationships. That activity made the movement of illegal goods easier to conceal. A suitcase arriving from South America did not stand alone. It moved among thousands of legitimate suitcases. A private aircraft did not automatically look criminal in a region full of flight schools, charter companies, wealthy travellers, agricultural operations, and recreational pilots. A fast boat was not unusual near a city built around water. Miami's older image was beginning to weaken at the same time. Downtown reached a serious low point during the 1970s. Visitors declined, established stores disappeared, and sections of the traditional shopping district became nearly empty after business hours. A local tourism history describes downtown by 6 in the evening as close to a ghost town. Miami Beach also had aging hotels and apartment buildings that had lost some of their earlier glamour. The city still attracted visitors, but parts of it looked tired, underused, and uncertain about what would come next. This created a useful contradiction. Miami remained famous, but it did not always feel prosperous. Its name suggested sun, leisure, and money. Its streets showed vacant storefronts, older buildings, economic inequality, and neighborhoods competing for public attention. When drug money began entering the local economy, it did not fall into a stable, transparent system where every large purchase attracted immediate concern. It entered a fast-growing region accustomed to cash, property speculation, foreign investment, tourism, and people arriving from somewhere else. Long before cocaine dominated the story, marijuana smuggling had already taught traffickers how to move contraband through South Florida. Marijuana was bulky. Large shipments required boats, aircraft, crews, unloading points, trucks, storage sites, and many people who could be arrested or could talk. Even so, profits were high enough to encourage increasingly organised operations. In March 1973, the Coast Guard cutter Dauntless stopped the fishing vessel Big L near the western edge of the Bahamas and made what the Coast Guard identifies as its first seizure of a marijuana smuggler. The case had begun with an undercover operation run by the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs in Miami, the federal agency that preceded the Drug Enforcement Administration. The seizure involved 1,130 pounds of marijuana. It was an early sign that maritime drug enforcement was becoming a permanent responsibility rather than an occasional problem. The DEA itself was created on July 1st, 1973, after the federal government consolidated several drug control functions into one agency. President Richard Nixon argued that separate agencies were struggling against international networks that ignored bureaucratic boundaries. The timing is important. The American government was reorganizing its drug enforcement system just as trafficking routes through South Florida were becoming larger, faster, and more sophisticated. At first, marijuana remained the most visible maritime cargo. A large vessel could wait beyond normal coastal patrols and transfer bales to smaller boats. These so-called mothership operations exploited legal and practical limits on enforcement. Smaller craft could scatter toward isolated landing points, canals, mangrove areas, marinas, and waterfront houses. A successful unloading might look less like a criminal invasion than an unusually busy night at a dock. The people who entered these operations were not all hardened professional gangsters. Some were pilots who wanted quick money. Some were fishermen whose legitimate work was becoming less reliable. Some owned boats and were paid to look away from the cargo. Some transported a load once and discovered that one trip paid more than months or years of ordinary labour. The Middle District of Florida's historical account of Everglades City describes how drug smuggling became deeply connected to a small fishing community, with a local knowledge of shallow water and mangrove islands becoming valuable to traffickers. That example was on Florida's Gulf side, but it showed the wider pattern. Established skills could be redirected into a new illegal economy. Cocaine changed the calculation. In the early 1970s, the American cocaine market was still relatively small. The drug carried an expensive, high-status image and was often treated by users as sophisticated or manageable, despite serious risks. The DEA Museum notes that cocaine re-emerged in the 1970s as an expensive status drug before becoming more widely available. Colombian traffickers increasingly took control of processing and distribution routes, and by the late 1970s, shipments of 50 to 100 kilograms were becoming routine. Miami and New York were developing into major American points of entry and distribution. Compared with marijuana, cocaine offered a smuggler a remarkable advantage. A valuable load could fit into a much smaller space. The cargo was easier to hide in luggage, false compartments, vehicles, boats, and aircraft. Fewer people could move it. A plane carrying cocaine did not need the same volume as a plane packed with marijuana. A courier could cross an airport carrying a quantity worth more than many legitimate workers earned in years. The compact cargo also allowed criminal organizations to become more selective. They could pay larger bribes. They could replace a lost shipment. They could hire lawyers before anyone was arrested. They could purchase communications equipment, vehicles, safe houses, and weapons. Most importantly, they could accumulate cash faster than law enforcement institutions could adjust. By 1977, members of Congress were travelling through South America because reports described a massive increase in cocaine trafficking. Their findings identified Colombia as the most important staging point for cocaine headed to the United States, with coca grown or processed through several Andean countries before moving north. The trade was no longer a collection of isolated couriers. It was becoming an international production and distribution system with financial methods designed to protect the people at the top. South Florida sat at the receiving end. Boats came through the Caribbean. Aircraft used legal and hidden landing areas. Couriers passed through Miami International Airport. Commercial vessels and private yachts provided additional cover. Once the cocaine arrived, local crews moved it into stash houses, then toward distributors in other American cities. Miami was not simply a consumer market. It was a transfer point, a financial center, and a place where the American side of the trade could be managed. Law enforcement could see pieces of the system without seeing all of it. Customs officers might find cocaine in luggage. Coast Guard crews might stop a suspicious vessel. Local detectives might arrest a dealer carrying cash and a weapon. Federal agents might follow a pilot, a telephone number, or a warehouse lease. Each case could be important while still revealing only one section of a much larger network. The FBI's Miami office in the 1970s was heavily occupied with white-collar crime, corruption, fraud, racketeering, gambling, and other organised criminal activity. Its major cases included investigations into bookmaking and union racketeering. The office's later history records that the FBI received broader authority to investigate drug matters alongside the DEA in 1983. That helps show how institutional responsibilities were still evolving while the cocaine trade accelerated. By 1978, the scale of South Florida trafficking could no longer be treated as a series of unrelated cases. A House committee investigation described the volume of marijuana and cocaine entering from South America as overwhelming. The committee heard that traffickers used trawlers, pleasure boats, cruise ships, aircraft, and couriers. Marijuana seizures at Miami's airport had quadrupled from 1977 to 1978. Authorities were intercepting tons of marijuana and kilograms of cocaine almost daily. Yet investigators estimated that they were seizing less than 5% of the total contraband entering the region. Think about what that estimate meant for the people working the docks, airports, courtrooms, and police stations. A seizure that looked enormous in a photograph might represent a small operating loss to the organisation behind it. Arresting a courier did not necessarily identify the supplier. Taking one boat did not close the route. A trafficker who expected to lose part of his cargo could treat enforcement as a business expense. The same congressional investigation found that millions of dollars in extra currency were being directed through the Federal Reserve System to meet cash demand in the Miami district. Officials understood that fortunes were being built through the drug trade. What they did not yet have was a coordinated system capable of tracing and seizing the money at the speed it was being generated. Cash was the clearest sign that something unusual was happening, but cash could be disguised as success. A young man with no obvious profession could buy a car and claim he had made a good investment. A company could report more customers than it really served. Property could be purchased through another person. Businesses that naturally handle cash could mix legal revenue with drug proceeds. Banks saw deposits, builders saw clients, car dealers saw buyers, restaurants saw spending. The money did not announce which part of it came from cocaine. For many residents, the transformation was still easy to miss. A family in Hialeah might notice a neighbour driving a new luxury car but know nothing about the source. A hotel clerk might see guests paying for several rooms and assume they were businessmen. A marina employee might repair a powerful engine without asking what the owner carried at night. A real estate agent might be pleased to find a buyer who did not need financing. Each interaction could remain ordinary when viewed alone. At street level, Miami was continuing with its normal arguments and celebrations. New communities competed for influence. Older residents worried that the city they knew was disappearing. Cuban Americans argued among themselves about politics, exile, business, and the future of Cuba. Black neighborhoods faced long-standing inequality and tense relations with law enforcement. Developers promoted new projects. Preservationists formed organizations to save Miami Beach's Art Deco buildings. Tourists still arrived. Retirees still sat in hotel lobbies. Children went to school while their parents tried to pay rent. The cocaine economy grew inside that ordinary life. It did not replace the city. It attached itself to the city's transportation, real estate, banking, nightlife, and international connections. Most people never saw a bale unloaded or a kilogram exchanged. They saw effects that did not yet seem connected. More cash, more expensive cars, private aircraft changing hands, unfamiliar men renting waterfront property, and occasional killings that looked personal rather than strategic. The word cowboy eventually fit because many early traffickers operated with a mixture of nerve, improvisation, and poor discipline. Some smuggling crews were organised, others were reckless men carrying weapons and large amounts of money, relying on speed and intimidation rather than durable institutions. They were entering a market where the profits rose faster than rules could be established. That instability made violence likely. A marijuana shipment could involve a dispute, but cocaine compressed far more value into each betrayal. A missing suitcase might be worth a fortune. A pilot who changed plans, a courier who disappeared, a buyer who delayed payment, or a partner who suspected cheating could create a problem that criminals did not settle in court. The higher the profit became, the more dangerous trust became. By the end of the 1970s, the basic structure was in place. South American suppliers had access to growing quantities of cocaine. Miami offered water routes, air routes, immigrant connections, financial services, warehouses, buyers, and fast access to the rest of the United States. Federal and local agencies were working hard but remained divided by jurisdiction, limited resources, and incomplete intelligence. The public still understood only part of what was happening. The city had not yet reached the moment that would make the cocaine war impossible to ignore. Miami still looked like a place struggling through change rather than a battlefield. Yet the loads were becoming larger, the profits were becoming harder to hide, and the men competing for control were beginning to carry their disputes into public places. To see how the change accelerated, we have to follow the cocaine itself. From coca-growing regions in the Andes through processing networks in Colombia, across the Caribbean, and into the boats, aircraft, suitcases, and waterfront properties of South Florida. That route explains why Miami became more than a convenient entrance. It became the place where a new criminal industry learned how much money it could make, how quickly it could expand, and how far it was prepared to go when somebody stood in the way. The route began more than 2,000 miles south of Miami, in parts of the Andes where coca had been cultivated for centuries. Long before traffickers, nightclubs, private aircraft, and bundles of American currency became part of the story, indigenous communities used coca leaves in daily life. The leaves could be chewed or prepared as a mild stimulant. They helped people manage hunger, fatigue, and work at high elevations. That traditional use was far removed from the concentrated white powder that became fashionable in the United States during the 1970s. A coca leaf is not the same thing as cocaine hydrochloride. Turning an agricultural crop into a refined illegal drug required several stages, different locations, chemical supplies, transportation, and people willing to take risks at every point. During the early years of the modern trade, much of the coca was grown in Peru and Bolivia. Colombia became important because its traffickers were especially effective at purchasing partially processed material, refining it, organizing shipments, and connecting the product to American buyers. United States officials recognized the pattern before most Americans had heard the names of the organizations that would later dominate the news. A 1973 government assessment described Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia as major cocaine production or transit areas, while identifying Colombia as a central trafficking hub. By 1976, American diplomats were calling Colombia the key to reducing the amount of cocaine reaching the United States. This was not yet the fully developed cartel system remembered from the 1980s. The word cartel would later suggest a single disciplined organization with a clear structure, but the early cocaine business was less orderly. It included independent smugglers, family groups, exporters, pilots, brokers, couriers, corrupt officials, and criminal entrepreneurs who cooperated when cooperation was profitable. Some worked together on one shipment and competed on the next. Relationships could depend on family connections, regional loyalties, prison acquaintances, personal introductions, or a shared willingness to move money without asking many questions. Colombia was useful to these networks for several reasons. It sat between major coca-producing regions to the south and the Caribbean routes leading north. It had large cities where money, chemicals, communications and transportation could be arranged. It also had remote rural areas where illegal processing could be concealed. Its Caribbean coastline opened towards Central America, the islands, and Florida. The Guajira Peninsula in northern Colombia was already associated with large-scale marijuana exports, giving smugglers experience in loading vessels, bribing officials, maintaining coastal contacts, and delivering contraband to American customers. A trafficking organization did not need to control the entire route. One group could purchase coca material. Another could manage refinement. A pilot could carry the finished cocaine to an island staging point. A separate crew could take it from the island to Florida. Local distributors in Miami could receive the load without ever meeting the farmers, processors, or senior organizers in South America. Dividing the work reduced the damage caused by a single arrest. A courier might know the person who gave him a suitcase and the person waiting for it in Miami, but nothing about the people who financed the shipment. By the middle of the 1970s, American demand was making that system much more profitable. Cocaine returned to popular culture with a reputation that was dangerously different from the reputation of heroin. It was expensive, socially fashionable, and often presented as a drug for successful people rather than desperate ones. Users encountered it in clubs, private parties, entertainment circles, and professional settings. Some believed that occasional use involved little risk. The DEA Museum describes cocaine's 1970s return as that of an expensive, high-status drug whose use grew as availability increased and prices fell. That public image affected the business. A product associated with wealthy customers could command high prices. Small quantities produced large returns. Marijuana smugglers needed considerable space to carry a valuable load. Cocaine traffickers could place far more value inside a suitcase, an aircraft compartment, or a concealed section of a boat. A shipment did not have to weigh several tons to make everyone involved rich. Consider what that meant for transportation. A fishing boat loaded with marijuana was difficult to hide once officers boarded it. Bales occupied space, produced an odour, and required a large unloading crew. Cocaine could be divided into kilogram packages and distributed among several couriers or hidden in relatively small compartments. A pilot could carry a load worth a fortune without operating a cargo aircraft. A speedboat could move a significant shipment while still looking like one of many recreational vessels crossing South Florida's waters. The reduced volume also changed the consequences of theft. Stealing one package could create a serious financial dispute. Losing an entire load could involve money owed to suppliers, pilots, investors, guards, and distributors. People who had never met might be expecting payment from the same shipment. When it disappeared, each participant had a reason to suspect the others. Before those disputes produced open violence in Miami, the traffickers had to make the route dependable. The Caribbean gave them many options. An aircraft leaving northern South America could head toward the Bahamas rather than fly directly to a major American airport. A vessel could stop among the islands, transfer cargo, refuel, wait for instructions, or divide one shipment into several smaller loads. The people completing the final trip into Florida faced less distance and could blend into ordinary traffic between the islands and the mainland. The Bahamas presented an enforcement problem that was obvious on a map. The country consisted of hundreds of islands and cays spread over a wide area, while its population and police resources were limited. Tourism brought legitimate aircraft, yachts, fishing vessels, and visitors through the same region. A plane landing near a resort was not automatically suspicious. A boat heading toward Florida could be carrying vacationers, fish, supplies, marijuana, cocaine, or some combination of legal and illegal cargo. American diplomats were already concerned by the late 1970s. A 1978 State Department document warned that illegal trafficking through the Bahamas was increasing rapidly, while Bahamian authorities had modest resources. The United States valued Bahamian cooperation, but recognized that local police might be unable to respond quickly to the growing number of requests for assistance. The problem was not simply that traffickers had found a convenient route. They had found a region in which the number of possible landing places exceeded the ability of governments to watch them. Small airstrips were particularly useful. Some were official, others were little more than improved pieces of ground. A skilled pilot did not require a large terminal, baggage crew, or control tower. He needed enough surface to land, fuel for the next leg, and people prepared to move the cargo quickly. Islands could serve as storage points where larger deliveries from South America were broken into loads suitable for smaller aircraft and boats. The crews involved were often less glamorous than later films suggested. Pilots spent long hours studying fuel range, weather, weight, and the condition of landing strips. Boat captains worried about engines, tides, storms, navigation, and patrols. Mechanics were important because a failed engine could lead to arrest, loss of cargo, or death at sea. Loaders had to move packages rapidly. Drivers needed vehicles ready near the arrival point. Someone had to rent houses, reserve rooms, purchase fuel, and provide believable explanations when strangers asked questions. Miami offered everything required at the end of the route. It had a major international airport, a busy seaport, marinas, canals, warehouses, rental properties, trucking connections, and highways leading north. Private aviation was common across South Florida. Boats moved constantly between docks, islands, fishing grounds, and waterfront homes. Spanish-speaking traffickers could communicate easily in a city with strong commercial and family connections throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. None of those features was criminal by itself. That was precisely why they were valuable. The smugglers used normal systems. They purchased airline tickets, rented cars, registered companies, hired accountants, bought marine equipment, and leased warehouses. An illegal shipment often spent most of its journey surrounded by legal activity. Miami International Airport became one of the obvious pressure points. Couriers could arrive on commercial flights carrying cocaine in luggage, clothing, containers, or concealed compartments. Customs inspectors could not search every passenger with the same intensity. They relied on intelligence, behavior, travel patterns, documentation, and inspection methods that traffickers constantly tried to study and defeat. A courier was replaceable. That fact shaped the relationship between organizers and the people carrying the drugs. Some couriers understood the full risk and accepted it for money. Others were given incomplete information. A person might be told that the chance of inspection was small, that a contact would handle everything on arrival, or that a first offence would not lead to a serious sentence. Organisers could test a new route by sending small amounts before trusting it with a larger shipment. Pleasure boats offered another method. South Florida residents were accustomed to seeing vessels of different sizes moving at almost every hour. A boat returning from the Bahamas did not need to enter the port of Miami and unload beside commercial cargo. It could approach a private dock, marina, inlet, or isolated section of shoreline. Packages could be transferred at sea, allowing the original vessel to avoid American waters while a smaller local craft completed the delivery. Trawlers and commercial vessels carried larger shipments. Some loads were concealed among legitimate cargo. Others were placed on vessels created or modified for smuggling. Cruise ships supplied crowds in which couriers could disappear. Aircraft landed at small airports or remote fields. The 1978 congressional investigation into South Florida trafficking listed trawlers, pleasure boats, cruise ships, aircraft, and individual couriers among the methods being used to bring marijuana and cocaine from South America. Once a load reached South Florida, it usually moved to a stash location. This could be a rented house, apartment, motel room, warehouse, or legitimate business property. The purpose was temporary storage rather than long-term possession. Keeping cocaine in one place created risk. The organisation wanted it divided and delivered to buyers as soon as possible. The people receiving it had their own tasks. They checked the number of packages, inspected the condition of the load, contacted distributors, collected payment, and arranged transportation to other cities. Miami was an entrance, but much of the cocaine was intended for customers elsewhere. Cars carried it toward Atlanta, New York, Chicago, and other markets. Commercial flights moved couriers north. Trucks and vans provided room for larger quantities. The money travelled in the opposite direction. Buyers paid local distributors. Distributors paid wholesalers. Wholesalers sent the proceeds toward the importers and suppliers. That return journey could be more difficult than moving the cocaine. Powder was compact, but cash accumulated quickly. American currency had weight and volume. Large deposits could attract attention. Carrying it physically created the risk of robbery or seizure. Traffickers responded by using cash-intensive businesses, currency exchanges, banks, couriers, property purchases, and offshore financial centres. Some money remained in Miami and entered the local economy. Some moved through Caribbean accounts. Some returned to Colombia through couriers or business transactions. The same international connections that helped the drug reach Miami helped the proceeds leave it. By 1978, American and Colombian officials were discussing investigations into money being deposited in Florida by narcotics traffickers. Colombia's president-elect acknowledged that enforcement had reduced only a small portion of the drug flow and argued that the two governments would have to cooperate. The conversation showed that cocaine trafficking was already understood as both a transportation problem and a financial one. Seizing packages would not be enough if the organisation kept their profits, replaced arrested workers, and financed new routes. The amount of unexplained currency in South Florida became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Congressional investigators reported that millions of additional dollars were being sent through the Federal Reserve System to meet cash demand in the Miami district. The local economy did not reveal exactly which bills came from tourism, construction, international trade, or drugs, but law enforcement officials knew that cocaine profits were contributing heavily to the flow. Banks faced a system with fewer reporting controls than would exist later. Employees might see customers arrive with large quantities of cash, but the legal and regulatory response to suspicious deposits was still developing. A trafficker did not always need an elaborate international conspiracy. Sometimes he needed a bank willing to accept his money, a business that could report false income, or another person willing to place property in a different name. The speed of the trade made conventional investigations difficult. Police worked cases by identifying suspects, observing meetings, using informants, tracing telephone calls, and following vehicles. Those methods required time. A trafficking crew could change its telephone numbers, replace a driver, abandon a rental house, and move to another marina in a single day. An officer who seized one shipment might not know whether the people arrested were independent smugglers or one small section of a large organisation. Jurisdiction made the problem harder. Customs officers worked at borders and ports of entry. The Coast Guard operated at sea. The DEA investigated drug organisations. Local police handled crimes inside their cities. County officers covered other areas. Federal prosecutors made decisions under federal law, while state prosecutors handled state cases. Intelligence did not always move quickly between agencies, and each organisation had its own authority, procedures, priorities, and limited staff. The results could appear impressive while leaving the overall system intact. Officers displayed seized packages for cameras. Newspapers reported the estimated value. Defendants were taken to court. Yet congressional investigators concluded in 1978 that authorities were intercepting less than 5% of the contraband entering South Florida. Marijuana seizures at Miami's airport had quadrupled from 1977 to 1978, and officials were seizing tons of marijuana and kilograms of cocaine almost daily. Those numbers did not reassure the committee. They demonstrated the size of the traffic that remained. A 5% interception rate meant that traffickers could plan for losses. They could send several loads and remain profitable if one disappeared. An arrested courier could be replaced. A seized boat could be treated as equipment that had completed enough successful trips to justify its cost. Law enforcement viewed each seizure as a victory. The organizations often viewed it as an operating expense. Colombian authorities faced their own limitations. Corruption was a serious concern. Traffickers could use money to obtain information, delay investigations, avoid checkpoints, or protect processing and departure locations. The national government also had to manage political instability, armed groups, regional power structures, and limited state control in some rural areas. American officials debated how much assistance to provide and whether Colombian institutions could use it effectively. In 1977, the Carter administration received reports that official corruption in Colombia was contributing to cocaine traffic. The United States temporarily held up the delivery of helicopters while pressing Colombian leaders for action. In 1978, Colombia prepared an offensive involving its military and aimed partly at the export of cocaine and marijuana from the Guajira region. Washington supplied non-lethal equipment, but the operation faced an industry that could change routes when pressure increased. Route changes became a standard part of the business. When airport inspections improved, traffickers used more private aircraft. When radar coverage threatened direct flights, pilots changed altitude, timing, landing places, or staging points. When maritime patrols concentrated on one channel, boats shifted to another. When a stash house was discovered, the next shipment went somewhere else. American agencies began developing better air interdiction methods in the early 1980s. Customs radar operators worked inside the Federal Aviation Administration's Miami control system to identify low, slow aircraft whose movements resembled smuggling flights. Enforcement teams could then follow a suspicious aircraft toward its landing point. Those measures reduced some direct flights into remote Florida fields, but they also encouraged traffickers to rely more heavily on complicated routes, offshore transfers, and different arrival methods. The enforcement response followed the smugglers rather than getting ahead of them. That was not because agents lacked courage or effort. They were confronting a market that rewarded adaptation with extraordinary profits. A smuggling organization could purchase another aircraft faster than a government agency could purchase and deploy a new radar system. It could pay a pilot more for one trip than the government paid an officer over many months. The difference in resources became visible in small ways. Investigators drove ordinary government vehicles while targets purchased high-performance cars. Police departments requested additional radios, surveillance equipment, officers and aircraft. Traffickers bought secure communications, night vision equipment, boats with powerful engines and properties that provided private access to the water. The most valuable resource was not equipment, it was information. Smugglers wanted to know when patrols changed shifts, which docks were watched, which inspectors were experienced, which aircraft had been noticed, and whether anyone in the organization had begun cooperating. Law enforcement wanted to know where the next load would arrive, who financed it, where it would be stored, and who would collect the money. Informants became central to both sides. Agents paid people for information or offered consideration in criminal cases. Traffickers paid dock workers, drivers, pilots, and anyone who could warn them of danger. A person could work for an organization while secretly speaking to the DEA. Another could pretend to cooperate with agents while reporting their questions to the traffickers. Suspicion spread because the business depended on secrecy, but required many workers. The larger the shipments became, the more people had to be trusted. Each new pilot, guard, courier, mechanic, girlfriend, accountant, and warehouse employee created another possible source of information. Cocaine made cooperation profitable, but it also made betrayal profitable. Miami's role grew because the full network was now functioning. Coca traveled from producing regions. Colombian groups refined and packaged it. Aircraft and vessels moved it through the Caribbean. Couriers and local crews brought it into South Florida. Stash house operators received it. Distributors sent it through the United States. Money handlers collected the proceeds and placed them into businesses, banks, property, or outbound shipments. No single person had to understand every stage. The system survived because it was divided. Remove one courier, and another could carry the suitcase. Seize one boat, and another captain could make the crossing. Close one airstrip, and a pilot could land somewhere else. Arrest one distributor, and his customers still wanted cocaine. The demand continued to increase. The price remained high enough to reward risk, but availability was improving. Shipments that once seemed unusually large became normal. Historical accounts of Colombian organized crime note that loads of 50 to 100 kilograms were routine by the late 1970s, and that trafficking organizations were firmly established in Miami and New York. 50 kilograms did not require an army to move, but it created enough money to hire one. Guards appeared around loads and cash. Buyers carried weapons because they feared robbery. Sellers carried weapons because they feared buyers. Drivers were paid to protect deliveries. Criminals who had entered the business as smugglers began employing men whose main qualification was a willingness to use violence. At first, much of that violence remained private. A missing courier might simply disappear. A body could be found without an obvious connection to cocaine. A murder inside a rented house looked like an isolated case until investigators found packaging material, cash or telephone numbers connecting it to another city. The public saw crimes. Detectives began to see a system. Reliable routes had solved the first major problem for the cocaine organizations. They could move the product into Miami with enough consistency to build a permanent market. That success created the next problem. Too many people wanted control of the same money, the same landing sites, the same distributors, and the same Colombian suppliers. The people who took advantage of that opportunity were not content to remain quiet transportation workers. They arrived with larger shipments, greater ambitions, and weapons close at hand. Miami had become the gateway. The next struggle would be over who controlled what passed through it. Control of the cocaine route did not pass to one organization in a single meeting. There was no official founding date, no headquarters sign, and no moment when a group of traffickers announced that Miami now belonged to them. The change happened through repeated shipments, profitable partnerships, family connections, and the removal of people who could not be trusted. By the end of the 1970s, the loose network carrying cocaine from Colombia into South Florida was becoming a professional criminal industry. The people later called cocaine cowboys were not all Colombian, and they did not all work for the same organization. Some were Miami residents who had learned smuggling through the marijuana trade. Others were pilots, boat captains, mechanics, couriers, money handlers, or distributors. A smaller number were representatives of powerful Colombian suppliers who came to South Florida to supervise deliveries and protect the money moving back toward Colombia. Many of the early operators behaved more like independent businessmen than members of a traditional criminal organization. A pilot might work for one supplier this month and another supplier the next. A distributor could purchase cocaine from several sources. A boat owner might provide transportation without knowing who had financed the cargo. These arrangements helped the trade grow quickly, but they also created constant uncertainty. Nobody could be completely sure who controlled a shipment, who had been paid, or who might be speaking to law enforcement. The Colombian traffickers who succeeded were the ones who reduced that uncertainty. They built relationships that could handle several stages of the business at once. They arranged the purchase and refinement of cocaine, secured transportation, placed representatives in Miami, supplied wholesale distributors, and created methods for returning drug proceeds to South America. They did not need to own every boat or employ every courier. They needed reliable access to them. Pablo Escobar was one of the traffickers who emerged from this environment. He would later become the most famous leader associated with the Medellin cartel, but his early success depended on cooperation with other traffickers, transporters, financiers, and distributors. The organization remembered as the Medellin cartel was not a cartel in the strict economic sense of one company controlling an entire market. It was a group of connected organizations based largely around Medellin and other parts of Colombia. Its members sometimes shared routes, protection, suppliers, and political influence while continuing to operate their own businesses. The DEA describes Escobar as a leader of the violent Medellin organization, which eventually produced and exported cocaine on an enormous scale. The partnership model was practical. One trafficker might have access to processing laboratories. Another might control aircraft. Someone else might know distributors in Miami, New York, or Los Angeles. Wealthy Colombian families could provide legitimate businesses, land, social connections, or financial support. Men with criminal experience could provide intimidation and protection. When these skills were combined, the organization could move much larger shipments than an independent courier ever could. Miami became the American management center for many of these operations. Representatives were sent there to receive cocaine, supervise storage, negotiate with distributors, and arrange the return of money. A later federal case described how 4 brothers acting under Escobar's direction were sent to Miami beginning in 1979 to direct the Medellin organization's importation and distribution efforts. They held South Florida properties and businesses on Escobar's behalf, supported cocaine shipments entering Miami, and concealed money moving back to Colombia. This arrangement gave the Colombian suppliers more control over what happened after the drugs entered the United States. Earlier smugglers often sold a shipment to an American buyer and ended their involvement. Placing trusted people in Miami allowed suppliers to remain connected to the product farther down the distribution chain. That could increase profits because they were no longer selling only at the first available opportunity. It also allowed them to watch the people responsible for collecting their money. The representatives needed places to work without attracting attention. South Florida provided waterfront houses, apartments, warehouses, hotel rooms, office suites, farms, and ordinary suburban properties. A house could serve as a residence in the front rooms and a cocaine storage location in the garage. A business could employ real workers while also providing vehicles, paperwork, and an explanation for unusual amounts of cash. Property ownership created privacy, social respectability, and places where meetings could take place without renting a room under a false name every week. Traffickers did not always look like fugitives. Some dressed like successful executives. They ate in expensive restaurants, hired legitimate lawyers, opened bank accounts, and purchased property through ordinary sales. Others preferred the visible style that became associated with the period: gold jewellery, imported cars, tailored clothes, boats, nightclub tables, and large amounts of cash. Both approaches served a purpose. Quiet wealth could avoid attention. Displayed wealth could attract partners, impress customers, and establish status in a business where reputation affected survival. For young men watching from outside, the cocaine economy appeared to offer a direct route from modest circumstances to extraordinary wealth. A person who had spent years earning an hourly wage could be offered thousands of dollars to drive one vehicle, unload one boat, or allow a house to be used for one night. A pilot could make more from a successful trip than from months of legal flying. A mechanic who modified an aircraft or boat might receive cash without invoices or taxes. The money was difficult to refuse, especially when the first task appeared simple. The first payment often changed the calculation. A participant who completed one trip without being arrested could begin to believe that the danger had been exaggerated. He might use the money to buy a car, help his family, pay a debt, or start a legitimate business. When the organisation returned with a larger offer, refusing became harder. The participant had already broken the law, already accepted the money, and already allowed other criminals to learn where he lived. The drug business also rewarded people who could connect to groups that did not trust one another. A bilingual broker who knew Colombian suppliers and Cuban-American distributors could become more valuable than someone who carried a weapon. A person familiar with Miami's banks, airports, marinas, and real estate market could solve problems that traffickers arriving from Colombia could not solve alone. These intermediaries arranged introductions, translated negotiations, found properties, and identified workers. Most Cuban Americans in Miami had no involvement in cocaine trafficking, just as most Colombians had no involvement in the organization supplying it. Criminal networks, however, made use of existing communities because language and personal connections could reduce the need to deal with strangers. Some Cuban smugglers had experience from anti-Castro activities, maritime travel, or the marijuana business. Others were simply Miami residents who recognized a new opportunity. Colombian suppliers needed local knowledge, and Miami operators needed reliable access to cocaine. Their cooperation became one of the foundations of the South Florida trade. Women also played important roles, although later retellings often reduced the story to armed men. Women acted as couriers, organizers, financial intermediaries, property renters, distributors, and leaders. They were sometimes considered less suspicious by inspectors and police, which made them useful for transportation. They could travel as tourists, mothers, business people, or companions while carrying drugs, money, or instructions. Griselda Blanco was already involved in a major cocaine conspiracy before the term cocaine cowboys became common. Federal court records describe an organization operating between 1972 and 1975 that obtained cocaine in Colombia, brought it through Miami and other entry points, and moved it to New York. Blanco and 37 others were indicted in 1975 for conspiring to manufacture, import, and distribute cocaine. She remained outside American custody for years, using false identification and moving between countries before she was eventually arrested and convicted. Her early activity is important because it shows that women were not only carrying packages for male traffickers. Blanco was accused of participating in the organization and direction of an international network at a time when the modern cocaine trade was still developing. Her later reputation would become mixed with disputed stories, exaggerations, and accounts supplied by criminals who had reasons to lie. The documented conspiracy is enough to establish that she belonged among the significant early organizers. The cocaine itself usually arrived in kilogram packages. A kilogram was large enough to represent substantial wholesale value, but small enough to stack, hide, count, and transport. Packages were often wrapped to protect the powder from water and handling. Markings could identify a source, laboratory, shipment, or intended recipient. Once the load reached a stash location, workers counted the packages and checked for damage or theft. The count mattered because everyone expected a specific return. If an aircraft had left Colombia with 100 kilograms and only 98 reached the Miami receiver, somebody had to explain the missing 2. The loss might have occurred during loading, transit, unloading, or storage. It might have been an honest mistake, a payment secretly removed, or deliberate theft. In a legal company, investigators could examine records and insurance claims. In the cocaine business, accusations were settled by people who could not ask a court for help. Cocaine shipments were frequently financed by several participants. One person might provide money for the product, another paid for transportation. A distributor agreed to purchase part of the load in advance. The organizers could spread the risk, but they also multiplied the number of people demanding payment. If a shipment was seized, the loss traveled through the entire network. Profit still outweighed the losses. A successful organization could import cocaine at a cost far below its American wholesale value. The product could then be divided, resold, and diluted as it moved toward retail users. Every stage added a markup. The money collected in New York, Chicago, Atlanta, or another city returned to Miami through couriers, vehicles, banks, wire transfers, and business accounts. By 1978, a congressional investigation had concluded that fortunes were being built through the South Florida drug trade. The committee reported that millions of dollars in additional currency were being directed through the Federal Reserve System to satisfy the demand for cash in the Miami area. It also found that authorities were intercepting less than 5% of the drugs entering the region. The traffickers were not becoming rich because enforcement did nothing. They were becoming rich because the volume of successful shipments exceeded the volume being seized. The money accumulated in forms that were difficult to manage. A kilogram of cocaine occupied little space. The cash produced by selling it could fill bags, suitcases, closets, vehicles, and rooms. Retail purchases produced large numbers of $20 bills. Those bills moved upward from users to local dealers, from dealers to distributors, and from distributors to the Miami organizations responsible for the original shipment. Counting the money required workers and machines. Bills had to be checked, bundled, stored, transported, and protected. Cash could be stolen as easily as cocaine. A trusted money counter therefore became an important employee. Armed guards might be assigned to a room containing currency rather than drugs. Depositing the proceeds created another challenge. Banks were accustomed to cash from hotels, restaurants, tourism, retail businesses, and international customers. Miami was also receiving legitimate capital from Latin Americans who wanted to protect their savings from inflation, political instability, or possible confiscation. Drug money entered an environment where large international deposits were not automatically unusual. Federal investigators later traced more than $100 million in suspected drug proceeds through a small number of Miami area banks during a single year. Contemporary reporting also described billions of dollars in excess currency accumulating in the Miami Federal Reserve System, with officials attributing a significant portion to narcotics revenue. The scale showed that drug profits were no longer being hidden only under mattresses or carried back to Colombia in suitcases. They were passing through established financial institutions. Some bankers knowingly accepted suspicious deposits. Others may have preferred not to ask questions that could cost them profitable customers. A person arriving with bags of currency could divide the money among accounts, purchase cashier's checks, transfer funds abroad, or move it through companies. The laws and reporting systems used later to detect money laundering were not yet fully developed. The process of making illegal profits appear legitimate became more organised as the sums increased. A trafficker could report drug cash as revenue from a restaurant, nightclub, construction company, import business, or car dealership. The business paid expenses, issued checks, and created records that made the owner's wealth easier to explain. The company did not need to be completely fake. A real business with real customers could mix criminal proceeds with legitimate income. Real estate was especially attractive. Property absorbed large amounts of money and could increase in value. Houses provided status and privacy. Warehouses and farms could support the trafficking operation itself. Construction projects involved numerous contractors, purchases and payments that made the source of individual dollars difficult to trace. Luxury goods offered another way to convert cash. Traffickers bought cars, jewellery, watches, boats, artwork and expensive clothing. Dealers who accepted cash made sales and commissions. The buyer gained an asset that could be used, resold, given to someone else, or placed in another person's name. This spending affected people who had no connection to the cocaine trade. A legitimate business owner could find himself competing against a company supported by money that did not need to produce a normal profit. A buyer using drug proceeds could pay more for a property than someone relying on a salary and mortgage. Employees could receive jobs from businesses partly financed by cocaine. The illegal economy entered the legal economy without creating a clear boundary between them. It would be misleading to claim that cocaine money single-handedly built modern Miami. The city's growth also came from tourism, migration, construction, international trade, banking, and legitimate investment. Drug revenue was one influence among several. Its importance came from the speed and concentration with which it appeared. The money reached certain banks, neighbourhoods, businesses, and individuals in quantities that were difficult to explain through normal economic activity. Law enforcement agencies understood that following the money could expose leaders who never touched the cocaine. Arresting a courier removed one worker. Tracing a financial transaction might identify an organiser, a supplier, or the person responsible for several shipments. The federal government, however, had not yet developed all the laws, teams, and experience needed to attack money laundering effectively. A 1980 report from the Government Accountability Office concluded that federal efforts to immobilise major traffickers had fallen short. Major offenders were not consistently receiving long prison terms, and their financial resources were not being seized sufficiently. The report urged the DEA to improve its ability to identify and dismantle major organisations, rather than relying mainly on individual arrests and drug seizures. The DEA had begun using its Central Tactical Programme, known as CENTAC, to target large trafficking groups through coordinated investigations. GAO found the approach effective and recommended expanding it. The programme reflected a change in thinking. Agents were trying to identify the complete organisation, including leaders, communications, transportation and finances, instead of treating each seized load as a separate crime. Miami investigators faced a basic disadvantage. The cocaine organisations could grow faster than government teams could be created. Traffickers did not need legislative approval to hire another pilot or purchase another aircraft. They did not need separate budgets for surveillance, informants, or communications. Cash was available immediately. The organisations also used compartmentalisation. A courier knew little about the supplier. A stash house guard might know only a nickname and a telephone number. A distributor did not know where the aircraft landed. An accountant could manage companies without seeing cocaine. Arrested workers often lacked enough information to lead agents upward. When someone did have useful information, the organisations tried to discover it. Meetings were moved, telephone numbers changed, suspected informants were watched. Employees were tested with false details to see whether police appeared. Some traffickers used several vehicles during a short trip, or sent another car ahead to look for surveillance. Weapons became part of ordinary business precautions. A person collecting hundreds of thousands of dollars worried about police, but he also worried about robbery. Criminal crews learned that stealing a cocaine shipment could be more profitable than importing one. They impersonated police officers, followed couriers, entered stash houses and forced guards to surrender the product. A dealer who had not previously used violence began carrying a gun because the people around him carried guns. The resulting arms race changed the character of Miami's underworld. Guards were hired because a shipment was valuable. More guards were hired because the first guards might steal it. Buyers brought armed men because they did not trust sellers. Sellers brought armed men because they did not trust buyers. A routine exchange could involve several people who believed they were prepared for betrayal. The new wealth produced personal rivalries as well. A trafficker who displayed expensive cars and jewellery attracted admiration, but he also attracted thieves, kidnappers and competitors. Family members could become targets. Business disagreements became personal insults. Romantic relationships created additional routes for information, jealousy and revenge. Some operators attempted to maintain discipline and avoid public attention. Violence was bad for business because it brought detectives, newspapers, and pressure from government officials. Other crews were younger, less experienced, or more interested in immediate power. They considered intimidation part of their reputation. A supplier known to punish theft might have fewer problems collecting money. The organisations based in Colombia had their own methods of enforcement, but Miami provided a different environment. American police, courts, witnesses, and newspapers limited what traffickers could do openly. At the same time, The size of the city allowed a killer to leave a scene quickly, change vehicles, reach an airport, or disappear among people who did not know him. Homicide detectives began encountering cases that did not fit older patterns. A victim might have no visible criminal record but own property and vehicles beyond his apparent income. Another victim might be carrying false identification. Relatives refused to explain what he did for a living. Witnesses saw armed men but claimed they could not recognize them. Telephone records connected the victim to other people already under federal investigation. Cases crossed city and county boundaries. A person kidnapped in Miami might be found dead in another jurisdiction. Cocaine could be stored in one municipality, sold in another, and paid for in a third. Local detectives needed information held by federal agents, but cooperation was not always immediate. The FBI's Miami office was still heavily occupied with fraud, corruption, racketeering, and other organized crime investigations during the 1970s. Broader FBI authority to work drug matters jointly with the DEA came in 1983. Meanwhile, the number of participants continued to expand. Experienced smugglers trained new pilots and captains. Successful distributors hired friends and relatives. Money brought lawyers, accountants, and business advisors into the surrounding system. Some professionals knowingly assisted criminals. Others performed legitimate services without understanding the full source of a client's wealth. The distinction between a smuggler and a cartel representative became less obvious. A Miami operator might own the boat, arrange the landing, purchase part of the shipment, and distribute it to several cities. He was no longer simply transporting someone else's cocaine. He had become a partner in the organization. Colombian suppliers also developed competing connections in South Florida. Several groups could serve the same American market. They shared nationality and sometimes family or regional ties, but that did not make them allies. A distributor who changed suppliers could reveal information about prices, routes, and customers. A transporter might owe money to one group while working for another. The term cocaine cowboys had not yet entered common use. The people involved were described as smugglers, traffickers, dealers, Colombians, pilots, or organized criminals. The cowboy label would come from their willingness to carry weapons, settle disputes themselves, and behave in public with less caution than established organized crime groups. Traditional American crime organizations generally understood the value of controlling attention. They bribed and negotiated and used violence selectively. Many of the cocaine traffickers were building rules while the business was already expanding. They had more money than institutional experience. Some were disciplined, but others acted without considering how one public crime could change the response of an entire city. By 1979, the ingredients for that crime were present. Miami was receiving cocaine in growing quantities. Colombian groups had representatives in South Florida. Local distributors controlled valuable customer networks. Drug proceeds passed through banks, businesses, houses, and luxury purchases. Armed crews protected shipments and collected debts. Robbers searched for stash houses. Informants moved between traffickers and federal agents. A disagreement no longer concerned a few $1,000s. One disputed delivery could represent millions in future business. Removing a rival could provide access to his customers and suppliers. Killing a thief could serve as a warning to everyone who knew him. The cocaine trade had reached the point where private violence was becoming difficult to contain. The men carrying out executions were no longer satisfied with hidden rooms or isolated roads. They were willing to follow their targets into restaurants, shopping centres, hotels, and crowded streets. On July 11th, 1979, several armed men entered a liquor store at Dadeland Mall during the middle of the day. Shoppers were nearby. Employees were working. Cars were moving through the parking area. The gunmen carried enough firepower to make it clear that the rules had changed, and within minutes the name Cocaine Cowboys would begin moving through Miami. Wednesday, July 11th, 1979, began like an ordinary summer day in South Florida. The temperature was high, the air was humid, and Dudland Mall was busy with people shopping, eating lunch, and moving between the department stores and smaller businesses along its exterior. The mall stood in Kendall, south of central Miami, in an area associated more with suburban growth than organised crime. Families went there for clothes, household goods, food and air conditioning. Employees reported for regular afternoon shifts. Nothing about the location suggested that a dispute between international cocaine traffickers was about to be settled there with automatic weapons. A white Ford Econoline van was parked outside the mall near Crown Liquors and a neighbouring pizza restaurant. At first glance, it looked like a delivery vehicle. Red lettering had been painted onto the sides, suggesting that it belonged to a party supply company. The wording was slightly different on each side. One panel read, "Happy Time Complete Supply Party," while the other read, "Happy Time Complete Party Supply." The mistake was small enough to be missed by anyone walking past, but it later became one of the details investigators remembered. The van had been purchased for cash about a month earlier and altered for an operation that involved far more than delivering balloons and paper cups. Inside the van were reinforced steel panels, openings that could be used as gun ports, bullet-resistant equipment, and a collection of the weapons. Police would call it a war wagon. The name sounded theatrical, but the construction had a practical purpose. The people inside could approach a target, carry several armed men, survive return fire, and abandon the vehicle without leaving their own cars at the scene. The men who prepared it expected violence. They did not arrive at Dadeland hoping to frighten someone or negotiate a payment. Their target was German Jimenez Paneso, whose name appeared in records in several different orders and spellings. He was 37 years old and had become an important figure in Miami's cocaine trade. With him was 22-year-old Juan Carlos Hernandez, commonly described as his bodyguard. Paneso had access to enough money and faced enough danger that he reportedly travelled in a white Mercedes with bullet-resistant windows. He understood that cocaine created enemies. On that afternoon, the protection built into his car could not help him because he had stepped away from it. Paneso and Hernandez entered Crown Liquors. A contemporary account said Paneso intended to buy a bottle of Chivas Regal. It was a routine purchase, the kind of short stop that should have taken only a few minutes. The men waiting outside had apparently followed or located him and chose not to wait until he returned to the armoured Mercedes. They left the van and entered the store. The first shots were fired at close range. Later, federal allegations described one gunman using a .38 O-caliber pistol fitted with a silencer before another opened fire with an automatic weapon. Witnesses and early reports described submachine gun fire. Paneso and Hernandez were hit repeatedly and died inside the store. 2 Crown Liquors employees were wounded. At least 60 rounds were fired in the store and the surrounding area, with bullets striking shelves, walls, glass and vehicles outside. The attack lasted only a short time. That was part of what made it effective. The gunmen did not need to control the mall or exchange fire with police. They needed to enter, kill the 2 men, return to the van and leave before officers arrived. By the time shoppers and employees understood what had happened, the assailants were already moving away from the scene. The noise was difficult to mistake. Automatic gunfire inside a liquor store did not sound like a car backfiring or a dropped display. People ran, hid, or remained where they were because they could not tell where the bullets were going. Store employees called police. Shoppers who had come to purchase ordinary items found themselves looking for shelter inside one of the best-known malls in South Florida. When officers arrived, they saw a type of crime scene that Miami had experienced before, but rarely in a place this public. Drug traffickers had already been killing one another in houses, cars, motels, and isolated locations. Bodies had been found without clear explanations. Suspects had disappeared. Witnesses had refused to cooperate. Dadeland was different because there was no effort to move the violence away from innocent people. The killers had opened fire during the day in a functioning commercial centre. The county medical examiner compared the scene to Chicago, referring to the city's historic reputation for gang violence. Reporters immediately understood why the comparison mattered. Miami had spent decades advertising itself as a place of beaches, vacations, retirement, conventions, and international business. A machine gun attack in a suburban shopping mall presented another image, a city where foreign drug organizations could carry out an execution in front of the public and escape. The white van was discovered a few hours later, less than a mile from Dadeland. Abandoning it had been part of the plan. The killers could transfer to another car, remove clothing or weapons, and separate before police established roadblocks. Investigators processed the vehicle for fingerprints and physical evidence. They examined its modifications, the false company markings, and the weapons or equipment left behind. The van proved that the shooting was not an impulsive argument. It had required money, preparation, construction, surveillance, and several participants. Someone at the scene used the phrase "cocaine cowboys" to describe the gunmen. The exact officer credited with the wording varies in later retellings, but contemporary coverage established that the label appeared almost immediately. It worked because the public understood both halves. Cocaine identified the new source of wealth. Cowboys suggested armed men who imposed their own rules, answered to no court, and treated public space as territory in which they could settle disputes. The phrase was not a precise description of every trafficker in Miami. Many cocaine importers preferred bribery, secrecy, and quiet financial arrangements. They had no interest in attracting homicide detectives or newspaper reporters. Some criminal groups operated with careful discipline and understood that public violence threatened business. The Dadeland gunmen represented another part of the trade. Crews willing to use heavy weapons in a crowded location because the value of the dispute mattered more to them than the risk to anyone nearby. That distinction did not matter much to frightened residents. A name had been created, and it gave people a way to connect events that had previously seemed unrelated. The unfamiliar killings, luxury cars, large cash deposits, missing smugglers, private aircraft, and reports of Colombian cocaine organizations now belonged to one developing story. The cocaine cowboys had arrived, even though many of them had been working in South Florida for years. Newspapers placed the Dadeland attack prominently on their front pages. National outlets followed it because the location made the story easy to understand. Americans who knew little about wholesale cocaine distribution understood what a shopping mall was. They could imagine stopping for a bottle of liquor or walking through a parking lot and hearing automatic fire. The crime removed the distance between drug trafficking and ordinary life. Only 13 days after the attack, a United States House committee began hearings devoted to cocaine as a major national drug issue. Officials testified about rising use, South American production, smuggling routes, health consequences, and the growing power of trafficking organizations. The timing did not mean the Dadeland murders created federal concern. Congress had already been studying the problem. The shooting gave that concern a recent and highly visible example. Investigators faced pressure to explain who had ordered the killing. Panesso was not a random victim. His position in the cocaine business meant the motive probably involved money, territory, a stolen shipment, a personal rivalry, or several of those factors together. Detectives had to identify the people who had been working with him, the suppliers he owed, the distributors who depended on him, and the rivals who benefited from his death. That work was complicated by the structure of the trade. Panesso's associates did not have a legal reason to describe their relationships. Admitting that they knew him could expose them to drug charges or retaliation. Some witnesses knew only nicknames. Others had met intermediaries rather than the leaders responsible for the shipment. Telephone records, fingerprints, informants, financial documents, and later arrests would become more useful than voluntary statements from the people closest to him. The first public explanations were incomplete. Rumors spread quickly through Miami's drug circles, but rumors were not evidence. One account claimed Panesso had cheated another trafficker. Another blamed a romantic dispute. A third connected the killing to a larger struggle among Colombian organizations. Each version could contain part of the truth while protecting the person repeating it. Years later, federal prosecutors presented a more detailed theory. They alleged that Paneso had been involved in a conflict with Carlos Pinello Ramirez over a 40-kilogram cocaine transaction valued at approximately $3 million. According to a DEA agent quoted in court reporting, Ramirez joined with another faction led by a man known as Paco Sepulveda. The groups were said to operate within a larger network associated with Griselda Blanco, although rivalries among the factions were intense. The delay between the shooting and those allegations shows why cocaine murders were difficult to solve. The most useful witnesses were often criminals who cooperated only after their own arrests. Their information might arrive years after the crime. By then, suspects could be living in Colombia, serving sentences under different names or dead from later disputes. Physical evidence had to be matched against people whose fingerprints were not yet available when the original investigation began. In 1984, a federal prosecutor stated that fingerprints taken from Fernando Villega Hernandez matched prints recovered from the abandoned war wagon. Informants had also identified him as one of the gunmen. The allegation surfaced while Villega Hernandez was being sentenced for unrelated cocaine offences. The judge refused to treat the murder claims as proven facts and told prosecutors to present them to a grand jury if they had sufficient evidence. The exchange demonstrated the difference between what investigators believed and what they could establish in court. That difference was common throughout the cocaine wars. Police could be nearly certain that a person had ordered several killings without having a witness willing and able to testify. An informant might know the truth but have serious credibility problems. A hired gunman might provide information in exchange for a reduced sentence. Defense lawyers could show that the witness had lied before, participated in murders, or expected government assistance. The more violent the organisation, the harder it became to produce witnesses who were both informed and reliable. Dadeland also revealed how far the traffickers' equipment had advanced. The van was not a weapon imported from a battlefield. It was a commercially available American vehicle modified in South Florida. The guns came through an American firearms market in which legal and illegal weapons could be purchased, transferred, stolen, or resold. Bullet-resistant materials, body armour, radios, and powerful cars were available to anyone with enough money and the right contacts. The profits from cocaine allowed small groups to equip themselves beyond the normal expectations of local police. Patrol officers usually arrived after a crime had been reported. They could not position tactical teams outside every restaurant, mall, marina, or apartment connected to suspected traffickers. Detectives could investigate known organizations, but the number of new participants increased every time another shipment reached Miami. Fear affected the drug business as much as it affected the public. After Dadeland, distributors had additional reasons to hire bodyguards, armor vehicles, and carry automatic weapons. One organization's attack became another organization's justification for heavier protection. Traffickers who might have settled disputes through negotiation began planning for the possibility that a meeting was an ambush. The threat of robbery was equally important. Cocaine and cash were both valuable, portable, and impossible to report as stolen. If armed men took a shipment from a stash house, the owner could not call the police and file an insurance claim. He had to accept the loss, recover it himself, or establish a reputation that discouraged future robberies. Violence became a method of financial regulation inside a market without contracts or courts. The Dadeland attack communicated that message to people far beyond Paneso's organization. A trafficker who failed to pay could be reached in public. An armoured car did not guarantee safety. Bodyguards could die beside the person they protected. A crowded location did not prevent an execution. The gunmen had made the cost of a dispute visible to every dealer who read the newspaper. Miami residents began changing their own behaviour. Sudden noises in parking garages or shopping areas caused people to think about gunfire. One Miami Herald writer later recalled that an unrelated burst of sound at another mall sent him running inside because the Dadeland shooting was still fresh in his mind. That reaction mattered. Public fear does not require everyone to witness a crime. It requires people to believe that a similar crime can happen where they are standing. The city's broader problems intensified that fear. In May 1980, Miami experienced several days of civil disorder after police officers were acquitted in the death of Arthur McDuffie, a black insurance salesman who had died after being beaten following a traffic pursuit. 17 people were killed during the unrest, hundreds were injured, and buildings were damaged or destroyed. That event came from racial injustice, distrust of law enforcement, unemployment and long-standing inequality, not from the cocaine trade. It occurred in the same city at the same time, adding another source of violence and national attention. The Mariel boat lift brought roughly 125,000 Cubans to South Florida during 1980. Most were ordinary people seeking a new life. A small portion had criminal records or serious mental health problems, and political leaders and newspapers sometimes used that minority to describe the entire group unfairly. The rapid arrival placed pressure on housing, employment, social services, police, and local government. Cocaine violence, racial conflict, migration, economic strain, and ordinary crime were often combined in public discussion even when their causes were different. Dade County recorded 569 homicides in 1980, with a rate of approximately 35 victims per 100,000 residents. Researchers later identified 1980 as one of the major homicide peaks in the county's 20th century history. Drug rip-offs were among the most common recorded motives, although arguments, robberies, domestic violence, the May riots, and other causes also contributed. It would be inaccurate to blame every killing on cocaine, but the drug trade had become a major part of the increase. A study of Dade County homicides between 1978 and 1982 found that almost 1/4 were drug-related. During that 5-year period, the county experienced a 60% increase in homicides. Most drug-related killings involved firearms, and Hispanic victims made up a much larger share of drug-related homicide victims than of other homicide victims. The figures confirmed what detectives had begun observing before the statistics were compiled. Cocaine distribution was producing a distinct category of murder tied to importation, debt, theft, and competition. Police departments responded by creating specialized units, improving intelligence sharing, and assigning more investigators to narcotics-related homicides. Detectives learned to look beyond the immediate crime scene. A murder victim's phone numbers, travel history, bank records, vehicles, and immigration documents could reveal connections to a trafficking organization. A kilogram wrapper or money counting machine might be more useful than statements from neighbors. Federal cooperation remained uneven. The DEA focused on drug organizations. Customs watched borders, airports, and ports. The Coast Guard handled maritime interdiction. Local police investigated shootings and bodies found within their jurisdictions. The FBI would not receive broad authority to investigate drug matters jointly with the DEA until 1983. Before then, agencies could share information, but different legal responsibilities and priorities made coordinated action difficult. The traffickers benefited whenever information moved slowly. A homicide detective might know that a victim was a cocaine distributor, without knowing that the DEA had been monitoring his supplier. Federal agents might protect an informant whose name local investigators wanted in a murder case. Prosecutors had to decide whether solving one killing was worth exposing a source who could help dismantle a larger organization. Political leaders demanded stronger action, but the federal response developed in stages. The South Florida Drug Task Force was not created immediately after Dadeland. It came in 1982, after the cocaine trade had expanded further, and agents seized a shipment valued at about $100 million from a Miami International Airport hangar. President Ronald Reagan assigned Vice President George H.W. Bush to coordinate the task force, bringing federal agencies together around South Florida. Dadeland remained one of the events officials and journalists used to explain why the region required exceptional attention. The attack also changed how reporters covered organised crime. A drug seizure was no longer only a story about the weight and estimated street value of cocaine. Journalists began connecting shipments to murders, financial institutions, real estate, foreign suppliers, and corruption. Police reporters learned the names of Colombian groups and Miami distributors. Homicide stories increasingly included information about kilograms, debts, and missing cash. The public coverage sometimes created distortions. Every unexplained luxury car became evidence of drug money. Every Colombian victim was assumed to be a trafficker. Immigrant communities complained, with reason, that the crimes of a small number of people were being used to define entire nationalities. The most dramatic stories received the most attention, while the legal businesses and ordinary families building Miami received less. Even with those distortions, the central warning was accurate. Cocaine organizations had accumulated enough money and confidence to conduct military-style attacks in public. They could purchase equipment, hire gunmen, and replace workers lost to arrest or murder. Their disputes were no longer contained within hidden sections of the city. Dadeland was not the first killing of Miami's cocaine era, and it did not begin every conflict that followed. Its importance came from location, timing, and visibility. The shooting took place in daylight, inside a familiar suburban mall, at the moment when cocaine imports and profits were rising rapidly. It gave a scattered series of crimes a recognizable name. The men responsible had also exposed a larger organization. The later allegations surrounding the attack pointed toward rival groups that cooperated, competed, stole from one another, and answered to powerful suppliers. Among the names appearing behind those groups was Griselda Blanco, a trafficker whose organization had already moved cocaine through Miami and New York, and whose use of violence would become central to the next stage of the conflict. Her role has often been enlarged by legend, television, and the claims of former criminals. The verified record is violent enough without embellishment. By the time investigators understood how her network operated, Miami had already experienced assassinations in houses, attacks on cars, murdered children, and gunmen who treated a shopping mall as a place to collect a debt. After the Dadeland Mall shooting, investigators kept returning to one name. Griselda Blanco was not charged with ordering the attack, and no court ever established her responsibility for it. Miami detectives nevertheless believed that the gunmen were connected to factions operating within her wider cocaine network. The distinction matters because Blanco's life has accumulated so many legends that the verified crimes are sometimes mixed with stories that cannot be proved. She has been described as the cocaine godmother, the Black Widow, the Queen of Cocaine, and the most dangerous woman in the history of the drug trade. Some accounts claim that she ordered hundreds of murders. Miami detectives gave a more cautious estimate, linking her to roughly 40 killings in Miami and New York. She was eventually convicted of involvement in 3. Those 3 cases were enough to show how her organization responded to debts, disobedience, and personal disputes. Blanco's documented American trafficking career began before Miami became nationally associated with cocaine. On April 30th, 1975, a federal grand jury in New York indicted her and 37 other people for conspiring to manufacture, import, and distribute cocaine. Prosecutors alleged that the organization operated between 1972 and 1975, obtaining cocaine in Colombia, moving it through Miami and other entry points, and delivering it to New York. The indictment did not describe a small courier ring. It involved suppliers, transporters, dealers, and people responsible for receiving shipments in the United States. By January 1976, 12 members of the conspiracy had been prosecuted and convicted, while 2 others had pleaded guilty. Blanco remained in Colombia and avoided arrest. Evidence presented years later showed how experimental some of the early smuggling methods could be. In one incident, A courier was arrested at Kennedy Airport with cocaine hidden in a dog cage. A government witness testified that Blanco had discussed using dog cages and later spoke about the loss after the courier was caught. The method sounds crude compared with the aircraft and maritime operations that followed, but it showed the basic advantage cocaine offered. A valuable quantity could be concealed inside an ordinary object and carried through a commercial airport by one person. Other methods were designed around clothing. Miami reporting later described a Medellin business that produced bras and girdles with compartments intended to conceal cocaine. Couriers wearing those garments could board commercial flights and appear to be ordinary travellers. The organisation did not depend on one method. Suitcases, clothing, containers, private aircraft, boats, and body cavities were all used by traffickers during the period. When customs officers learned one hiding technique, another could replace it. Blanco's position was unusual, although it was not unique. The cocaine trade was dominated publicly by men, but the business rewarded anyone who could maintain supply, control couriers, collect money, and frighten competitors. She did not need formal recognition from male traffickers. She needed access to cocaine in Colombia and dependable distribution in the United States. Being underestimated may initially have helped her. Police officers, customs inspectors, and rival dealers often expected a criminal organisation to be led by men. A woman could travel, rent property, accompany couriers, or manage family members without fitting the image of a major trafficker. That advantage disappeared as investigators learned her name, but by then she'd developed roots and relationships that were difficult to replace. Her organisation relied heavily on personal connections. Family members participated in the business, including her sons. Trusted associates handled couriers, stash houses, payments, and transportation. The use of relatives reduced some risks because blood relationships could be harder to abandon than temporary business partnerships. It created other risks because family conflicts became organisational conflicts, and private arguments could affect shipments worth millions of dollars. Blanco understood that loyalty could not be purchased once and then assumed forever. A courier who completed several trips knew the route. A driver knew where cocaine was stored. A money counter knew how much cash had been collected. A bodyguard knew where the leader slept and which vehicles she used. The longer someone worked inside the organisation, the more useful and dangerous that person became. Traffickers tried to manage the danger by dividing information. A courier might know the person who supplied a suitcase but not the name of the person financing it. A driver could be given an address only minutes before a delivery. A gunman might receive a photograph and a location without being told why the target had been selected. Compartmentalization protected the organisation from police, but it did not eliminate fear. Workers still understood that they could be blamed for anything that went wrong. Blanco's organisation developed a reputation for treating violence as a routine management tool. A missing payment was not only a financial loss, it was a test of authority. Allow one distributor to keep money, and others might decide that payment was optional. Permit one courier to steal part of a shipment, and every later load became vulnerable. Killing the offender could cost less than allowing the example to spread. This did not mean every dispute ended in murder. Traffickers negotiated, accepted partial payments, changed business partners, and arranged compensation. Violence was expensive and attracted police attention. It became more likely when Blanco believed that a person had challenged her authority, embarrassed her, threatened her family, or shown that others could disobey without consequences. The people who carried out the killings were often called pistoleros or sicarios. Some were full-time enforcers. Others transported cocaine and performed murders when required. A gunman could be paid with cash, drugs, protection, or a position inside the organisation. The job required fewer specialised skills than piloting an aircraft, but it demanded a willingness to approach people who might also be armed. The gunmen learned their targets' routines. They watched houses, restaurants, businesses, and nightclubs. They followed cars and looked for moments when bodyguards were absent. Motorcycles became useful because they could move through traffic, approach a vehicle closely, and leave through spaces a car could not use. Blanco was later credited by investigators with helping popularize motorcycle assassinations in the cocaine underworld, although separating her specific innovations from methods already used in Latin American crime is difficult. A killing did not have to be technically complicated. Many victims knew the people sent to murder them. An associate could arrange a meeting, enter a house, or persuade the target to lower his guard. The business created constant contact between people who distrusted one another, but still had to exchange cocaine and money. That was one reason betrayal became common. A trafficker could provide information to the police in exchange for leniency. A bodyguard could sell his employer's location to a rival. A distributor could pretend that a shipment had been seized and keep it. A pilot could land somewhere else and sell the cargo to another buyer. A gunman could take payment from both sides. Rumours had practical consequences. When someone was accused of informing, the organisation did not wait for a formal investigation. Police files could be wrong, and enemies could invent accusations, but traffickers had no neutral authority to determine the truth. They acted on suspicion, often before the suspected person had a chance to explain. Blanco's name became connected to the Dudland attack through this world of rival factions. Later, federal allegations described a dispute over 40 kilograms of cocaine worth approximately $3 million. German Jimenez Panesso, one of the men killed inside Crown Liquors, was said to be involved in a conflict with Carlos Ramirez. Ramirez was reportedly aligned with another group led by Paco Sepulveda. Investigators placed these competing groups within the wider network associated with Blanco. The description does not present Blanco as the unquestioned commander of everyone involved. It presents a network in which factions cooperated in trafficking and competed over money. The people under the same broad organisational umbrella could become enemies when a shipment disappeared or a payment was disputed. The war wagon used at Dadeland demonstrated the resources available to those factions. The vehicle had been modified for an armed attack. The gunmen had automatic weapons, protective equipment, and an escape plan. An operation like that required more than an angry dealer with a pistol. Someone had to purchase the van, alter it, obtain weapons, locate Panesso, recruit shooters, and arrange transportation away from the abandoned vehicle. Investigators linked the attack to Blanco, but prosecutors never tried her for it. This is an important limit in the historical record. The suspicion came from informants, criminal associations, later testimony, and evidence connecting participants to her network. Suspicion can explain why detectives focused on someone. It cannot be presented as a conviction. The killings for which she was held responsible came 3 years later. Alfredo and Griselle Lorenzo were cocaine dealers who had obtained 5 kilograms from Blanco's organisation. Prosecutors said the couple owed approximately $250,000. They lived in a South Miami house with their children. Debt collection in the cocaine trade usually began with calls, warnings and meetings. The supplier wanted the money, not a homicide investigation. The Lorenzos either could not pay, would not pay, or failed to satisfy Blanco's demands. Their debt became an example that she believed required a public answer within the organisation, even though the actual killing took place inside their home. Gunmen entered the house and killed Alfredo and Grisel while their 3 children were nearby watching television in another room. The children survived. They were left inside a house where their parents had been murdered over 5 kilograms of cocaine and an unpaid bill. Blanco later accepted criminal responsibility for the Lorenzo killings as part of her resolution of the Florida murder case. The murders served the organisation in 2 ways. They removed people Blanco considered unreliable, and they warned every distributor who heard what happened. The warning did not require a newspaper announcement. Drug organisations carried information quickly. Dealers learned who had been killed, what they owed, and who was believed to have ordered it. The second case began with a much smaller personal conflict. Jesus Chucho Castro had worked as an enforcer for Blanco. According to testimony later given to investigators, Castro had kicked one of her sons during an argument or dispute. Blanco wanted Castro killed. The order was assigned to gunmen including Jorge Rivi Ayala, who would later become one of the most important witnesses against her. In July 1982, the shooters found Castro travelling in a car with his 2-year-old son, Johnny. They opened fire. Castro survived. Johnny was struck in the head and died. Ayala later told investigators that Blanco was initially angry because the intended target had escaped. When she learned that Castro's child had been killed, Ayala claimed that she said the death made them even. That account came from a professional killer seeking cooperation with prosecutors, so it must be understood as testimony from a deeply compromised witness. It was nevertheless central to the case built against Blanco, and she eventually entered a no-contest plea covering the child's murder, along with the Lorenzo killings. Johnny Castro's death showed how little control gunmen had once they began shooting at moving vehicles in public places. The intended victim could survive. A passenger, pedestrian or child could die instead. The organisation might still treat the attack as successful if it created fear. Inside Miami's cocaine community, the effect of these killings was cumulative. People did not need to know whether every rumour about Blanco was true. They needed to believe that enough of them were true to make resistance dangerous. A distributor receiving cocaine from her organisation had to consider more than profit. He had to consider what would happen if the cocaine was stolen, if police seized the money, or if customers failed to pay him. His own explanation might be honest, but Blanco might decide that he had kept the proceeds. Once she believed he was lying, evidence mattered less than reputation. Employees feared both her and the people around her. A gunman could be ordered to kill a former friend. Refusing might make him the next target. Completing the order proved loyalty temporarily, but it also gave the organisation evidence that could be used against him. He became more dependent on the same people who had ordered the crime. The gunmen themselves were not safe. They knew too much and created too many enemies. Each murder produced relatives, partners and surviving associates who might seek revenge. A shooter who became famous could also attract police attention and become a liability to his employer. Jorge Ayala represented that problem. He was involved in multiple killings and possessed detailed knowledge of Blanco's organisation. Once he was arrested, that knowledge became valuable to prosecutors. Detectives learned about meetings, orders, debts, participants and conversations that had previously existed only inside the organisation. Ayala's cooperation also exposed the weakness of building a murder case around a professional criminal. He could describe crimes that no ordinary witness had seen, but defence lawyers could attack his credibility. He had killed people, lied, participated in trafficking, and expected benefits for helping the government. Jurors would have to decide whether a person capable of those acts was telling the truth about Blanco. The Florida murder prosecution eventually encountered an extraordinary scandal. While Ayala was held as the state's principal witness, employees connected to the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office engaged in improper sexual telephone conversations with him. The misconduct damaged the credibility and handling of the case, weakened the possibility of seeking the death penalty, and helped turn what prosecutors had hoped would be a major murder trial into a negotiated plea. The scandal happened years after the killings, but it confirmed one of the difficulties detectives had faced from the beginning. An organisation built on secrecy could often be penetrated only through insiders. Insiders brought information, but they also brought manipulation, personal motives, and credibility problems. During the early 1980s, detectives did not yet have Ayala's full account. They worked from crime scenes, surveillance, informants, intercepted communications, and the patterns connecting victims. One homicide might involve the same cars, telephone numbers, or associates as another. A dead distributor's address book could lead to a stash house. A seized courier could identify the person who had supplied her. Female detectives and customs officers were particularly useful when investigating women in the organisation. Male investigators sometimes treated female couriers as girlfriends or minor participants rather than independent criminals. That assumption allowed evidence to be missed. Officers who looked more closely found women renting properties. carrying cocaine, supervising money, and passing instructions. The investigation required cultural and language knowledge as well. Detectives needed Spanish speakers who could understand Colombian accents, slang, family relationships, and the meaning of nicknames. A mistranslated word could change the apparent role of a suspect. A name appearing in several forms could make one person look like several. Blanco made those problems harder by using aliases and false documents. The federal court record shows that she travelled under false names in Colombia and later used false identification while living in California. DEA agents tried for years to determine whether she had returned to the United States. At different times they heard that she'd been shot in Miami or killed, forcing them to check hospitals and even bodies being transported to Colombia. She had reason to remain hidden. The 1975 federal indictment was still active. Her associates had been convicted. Law enforcement officers knew she was wanted, and an informant reported that she avoided travel to the United States because of the case. Despite that caution, she eventually returned. By 1984, investigators determined that she was living in California under another identity. The move suggested that Miami had become too dangerous or too closely watched. It also placed her far from the city where her organization had developed its most violent reputation. Federal agents arrested Blanco in Irvine, California, in February 1985. She gave them a false name and carried false identification. Her trial began in New York that June. The prosecution relied heavily on Carmen Caban, a former dealer who described the cocaine conspiracy operating between 1972 and 1975. The jury convicted Blanco of conspiring to manufacture, import, and distribute cocaine. She received a 15-year federal sentence and a $25,000 fine. That conviction covered the earlier trafficking organization, not the Miami murders. The homicide investigation continued while she was in federal custody. Years passed before Florida prosecutors charged her and reached the no-contest agreement that held her responsible for the deaths of Alfredo and Grisel Lorenzo and 2-year-old Johnny Castro. Blanco's arrest did not remove the fear she had helped create. Her routes, couriers, distributors, and financial methods did not depend entirely on her physical presence. Other organizations were already larger. The Medellin traffickers were moving cocaine in quantities that exceeded the operations of the early pioneers. New suppliers could take over customers. Former employees could create their own crews. Her greatest influence may not have been a particular smuggling technique or one famous murder. It was the example set by an organization that combined international transportation, family management, money laundering, and hired violence. A supplier who adopted those methods did not need to know Blanco personally. By the time she was arrested, Miami's cocaine economy had moved beyond individual personalities. The city contained bankers willing to handle unexplained cash, property purchased through hidden ownership, luxury businesses supported by traffickers, and legitimate professionals earning fees from clients whose incomes did not withstand examination. The assassins created the headlines, but the money gave them somewhere to operate. Every kilogram sold produced currency that had to be counted, stored, deposited, invested, or sent abroad. The fear surrounding Blanco protected that process for a time. It discouraged witnesses, enforced debts, and kept employees loyal. Once the cash left the stash house, it entered a city eager for investment. It paid for houses, office buildings, restaurants, boats, jewellery, construction, and political access. Miami was beginning to change physically, and the cocaine economy was becoming harder to separate from the lawful businesses growing beside it. Once the cocaine had been sold, the traffickers faced a problem that could not be solved with another speedboat or a hidden aircraft compartment. They had to do something with the money. The product arrived in compact packages. Its proceeds did not. A kilogram of cocaine could be carried under one arm, but after it was divided, resold, and distributed through several American cities, The payments returned in stacks of small bills. Much of the cash came from street sales in 20s, 10s and 5s. It had to be collected, counted, bundled, guarded, transported, deposited, invested or moved out of the United States. A successful trafficking organisation could receive more currency than its employees could count by hand. Money counting machines became standard equipment in stash houses and financial offices. Workers sat near tables covered with bills, feeding one bundle after another through machines that clicked for hours. Guards protected the room. Accountants recorded amounts using names, numbers, initials, or coded references. Couriers waited for instructions about where the finished bundles should go. Cash created evidence. It could be photographed, seized, stolen, or connected to a person who had no lawful explanation for possessing it. A trafficker carrying cocaine might claim that he did not know what was inside a package. Explaining several suitcases filled with currency was more difficult. The first solution was the simplest: spend it. Miami offered no shortage of opportunities. Cars could be purchased for cash. So could boats, jewellery, watches, clothing, furniture, aircraft, houses, condominiums, and restaurant bills. Contemporary reporting described suspected traffickers arriving at dealerships and paying for luxury vehicles without financing. Yachts and residential properties also changed hands through cash transactions that avoided the ordinary questions created by mortgages and bank loans. WashingtonPost.com. The purchases were not only displays of wealth, they converted bundles of paper into assets. A car could be registered in another person's name, resold, or used to transport cocaine. A boat could provide pleasure during the day and carry contraband at night. A house could offer privacy, waterfront access, garage space, and rooms for storing drugs or cash. Jewellery could be carried across a border more easily than the money used to purchase it. Traffickers often placed assets in the names of relatives, girlfriends, employees, or companies. The person living in a house might not appear on the deed. The man driving a luxury car might claim it belonged to a business. A boat registered to a corporation could be used by people whose names appeared nowhere in the paperwork. This method worked as long as the owner did not need to explain where the purchasing money came from. A person with no reported income could attract attention by buying several properties. To make the wealth appear lawful, traffickers required businesses. Cash-intensive businesses were especially useful because their real revenue was difficult to measure from the outside. Restaurants, bars, nightclubs, hotels, parking operations, retail stores, construction companies, and automobile dealerships could all receive cash from legitimate customers. Illegal proceeds could be mixed with that income and reported as sales. A restaurant might serve real meals and employ real workers while claiming more customers than it actually had. A nightclub could report busy evenings that never happened. A construction company could send invoices between related businesses. A car dealership could purchase and sell vehicles through complicated transactions that made the original source of the funds harder to identify. The trafficker did not always need to create a company from nothing. He could invest in an existing business whose owner needed money. The owner received capital and the trafficker gained a place to deposit cash. Some business people knowingly entered these arrangements. Others accepted investments without asking questions because the money arrived quickly and did not require the approval of a cautious lender. The cocaine economy therefore employed people who never saw cocaine. Waiters, mechanics, construction workers, sales clerks, bookkeepers, security guards, cleaners, real estate agents, and office employees could earn lawful wages from businesses, partly supported by illegal proceeds. A worker could spend years at a company without knowing that its owner used it to launder money. This is where the claim that cocaine rebuilt Miami requires care. Drug money influenced South Florida's economy, but it did not create Miami's growth by itself. The city was already receiving legitimate investment from Latin America, the Caribbean, Europe, and other parts of the United States. Cuban immigrants had built major businesses and financial institutions. Wealthy families from unstable Latin American countries purchased property in South Florida to protect their assets. Around 15,000 affluent Nicaraguans arrived or acquired residences after the fall of the Somoza government, with many purchases concentrated around Key Biscayne, Brickell Avenue and Sweetwater. Exhibits.library.miami.edu. Political instability produced what bankers called flight capital. Families worried about revolution, confiscation, inflation, currency controls or kidnapping moved savings into American accounts and property. Much of that money was completely legal. It arrived through many of the same banks and purchased many of the same assets favoured by traffickers. This overlap helped conceal cocaine proceeds. A banker looking at a large transfer from Latin America could not assume it came from drugs. A condominium purchased through a foreign corporation could belong to a legitimate investor, an exiled political figure, a corrupt official, a trafficker, or a company representing several people. Miami's real economy and illegal economy used the same institutions. Brickell Avenue became the clearest symbol of that mixture. The district south of the Miami River had once been associated with large private homes and wealthy local families. By the late 20th century, banks, offices, hotels, and condominium towers were replacing much of the older landscape. Miami was developing into a financial center for business between the United States and Latin America. Banks opened offices on and around Brickell because their customers needed international services. Legitimate importers required credit. Foreign companies needed American accounts. Exiles wanted safe places for savings. Investors purchased property and financed businesses. Spanish-speaking bankers who understood Latin American markets became valuable. Drug traffickers needed the same services for different reasons. They wanted accounts, wire transfers, cashier's checks, loans, safe deposit boxes, and access to foreign institutions. Their currency could enter the bank in Miami and appear elsewhere as an ordinary balance in an account owned by a company. The scale of the cash flow became visible through the Federal Reserve. Banks normally send excess currency to the Federal Reserve and request additional notes when customers withdraw more cash than they deposit. In South Florida, the amount of currency flowing into banks became unusually large. Other regions required shipments of money. Miami was returning billions in excess notes. Officials concluded that ordinary tourism and business could not fully explain the increase. A later congressional account described Operation Greenback as a federal project created in 1980 to investigate the unusual cash flow through South Florida's Federal Reserve System. Investigators determined that the expanding drug trade was a direct cause. Congress.gov. The cash did not arrive only from Miami drug users. Cocaine sold across the United States generated money that traveled back toward the importers. A distributor in New York could send currency by car or aircraft to Miami. Buyers from other states arrived carrying cash to purchase wholesale loads. Miami collected proceeds from a national market because it was one of the main points where American distributors met Colombian suppliers. A courier transporting money faced risks similar to those faced by a cocaine courier. Police could stop the vehicle. Airport inspectors could search a suitcase. Robbers could intercept the delivery. The courier could disappear with the funds. Organizations divided the money among several people or concealed it inside vehicles, boxes, clothing, and luggage. Some shipments left the country physically. Couriers boarded flights to Colombia, Panama, the Bahamas, or other financial centers carrying currency. Private aircraft offered more space and less inspection. Boats that had delivered cocaine could return south with money. A smuggling route therefore worked in both directions. Cocaine moved north and cash moved south. Other proceeds remained in South Florida banks. The Bank Secrecy Act had been passed in 1970, partly because Congress was concerned about people bringing unexplained bags of currency into financial institutions. The law required banks to report cash transactions above $10,000, identify the people conducting them, and preserve records that could create a financial trail. IRS.gov. The existence of the rule did not guarantee compliance. Some banks failed to file the required reports. Employees could divide deposits among several accounts or accept repeated transactions below the reporting amount. Customers used couriers and companies to prevent one name from appearing too often. A trafficker might purchase cashier's checks with cash and then deposit the checks elsewhere, placing another step between the illegal sale and the final account. Bank officers did not always know that a customer was a trafficker. They saw companies, identification documents, account applications, and cash. A customer who claimed to own a successful import business might appear believable in a city where international commerce was growing rapidly. Other bankers understood exactly what they were seeing. Large cash customers produced deposits, fees, and business. Turning them away meant sending the money to a competitor. Some institutions treated reporting rules as an inconvenience. A small number became active participants, helping customers conceal transactions or move funds abroad. The federal response began to shift from searching for cocaine to searching for its proceeds. Operation Greenback brought together agents from the Internal Revenue Service, Customs Service, Justice Department, and other federal offices. The task force examined bank records, currency reports, tax returns, corporate documents, property purchases, and international transfers. Its investigators included accountants and financial specialists as well as traditional law enforcement officers. This was a different kind of drug investigation. An agent did not have to follow a speedboat at night. She might spend weeks studying deposits, comparing company revenue with tax filings, or identifying several businesses controlled by the same hidden owner. The evidence appeared in ledgers, checks, forms, and account statements, rather than packages of white powder. Agents also worked undercover. They posed as people willing to move currency, exchange money, or arrange offshore transactions. The goal was to identify the financial managers trusted by several trafficking organizations. Arresting one high-level money launderer could expose the proceeds of many cocaine shipments. Operation Greenback's first years produced cases involving multiple narcotics organizations and large sums of trafficked currency. A former senior agent later described the task force as an effort that began when investigators recognized the enormous amount of money passing through South Florida and learned to use tax laws and Bank Secrecy Act records against foreign traffickers. PBS.org. The government was trying to attack the part of the trade that traffickers considered permanent. Cocaine could be replaced. A seized boat could be replaced. A courier could be replaced. Money invested in property, businesses, aircraft, and bank accounts represented the accumulated success of many shipments. Taking those assets could damage the organization beyond the loss of one load. Federal agencies were not yet good at doing that. A 1980 Government Accountability Office report concluded that forfeitures were tiny compared with criminal profits and often amounted to little more than operating expenses. The government lacked basic information and coordinated methods for tracing and taking property acquired through crime. Much of the wealth remained untouched even when traffickers were convicted, Gow.gov. The legal tools were still developing. During the early cocaine boom, money laundering was not yet a separate federal crime under the law later used against financial organizations. Prosecutors relied on tax charges, conspiracy laws, false statements, reporting violations, drug offences, and other statutes. The Money Laundering Control Act of 1986 finally established money laundering itself as a federal offence, FinCEN.gov. Before that change, investigators often had to prove that a person had violated a reporting requirement or participated directly in the drug conspiracy. Handling suspicious cash was not always enough. A lawyer, accountant, banker, or real estate professional could claim to have performed an ordinary service without knowing the money's origin. Real estate was particularly difficult to examine. Property transactions involved buyers, sellers, brokers, attorneys, corporations, lenders, title companies, and recorded documents. Adding a shell company or offshore owner created distance between the trafficker and the building. Once purchased, property could generate rent, secure a loan, or be sold later for funds that appeared to come from a lawful transaction. Cash buyers also changed the market. They could close quickly and did not have to satisfy a mortgage lender. A legitimate buyer, depending on financing, might lose a house to someone offering immediate payment. Developers saw demand for condominiums, office space and land, and responded by building more. Contemporary observers suspected that cocaine money was contributing to rising prices and construction. A 1981 investigation reported that suspected drug funds had entered large land purchases and condominium sales, although it also emphasized that legitimate foreign and domestic investment remained a major part of the market. WashingtonPost.com. That caution is essential. It is easy to look at a tower built during the period and declare that cocaine paid for it. Proving the source of construction financing requires records that often do not survive or were designed to conceal ownership. Some projects received direct investment from traffickers. Others benefited indirectly when drug money increased deposits, purchases, and local spending. Many were financed through lawful investors who had no relationship to the cocaine trade. The influence extended beyond buildings owned by criminals. A trafficker bought a house, and the seller used the proceeds to purchase another property. The contractor hired workers. The workers spent wages at local stores. The car dealer deposited the payment. The bank used its deposits in other lending. Illegal money circulated through lawful transactions and became increasingly difficult to identify. Sales taxes and business fees also reached local government. A city did not ask whether every restaurant bill or luxury purchase had been paid with honest income. Public institutions could benefit indirectly from spending while simultaneously paying the cost of additional police, courts, jails, emergency care and corruption investigations. Drug money did not benefit every part of Miami equally. Neighborhoods experiencing the worst violence often received little of the investment. Black communities already affected by segregation, unemployment, poor services, and tense relations with police did not suddenly gain access to the wealth appearing on Brickell Avenue. Many working families faced higher housing costs without receiving the profits that helped raise them. The contrast became difficult to ignore. New offices and condominiums rose while homicide detectives worked through growing caseloads. Luxury vehicles passed neighborhoods where public services remained weak. Banks accepted large deposits, while local agencies requested more money for radios, officers, vehicles, and forensic staff. Cocaine also changed the city's culture of success. Sudden wealth became common enough that people stopped expecting a clear explanation for it. A young man could appear with a boat, a large house, and several cars and describe himself as an importer, investor, builder, or consultant. Questions were sometimes considered impolite, unnecessary, or dangerous. Nightlife gave the new money a place to be displayed. Restaurants and clubs competed for customers willing to purchase expensive bottles, reserve tables, and spend freely. Legitimate entertainers, athletes, professionals, tourists, traffickers, informants, undercover agents, and police officers could occupy the same room. A nightclub meeting could begin as entertainment and become a business negotiation. Introductions were made through friends. A dealer met a pilot. A financier met someone with Colombian contacts. A police officer working security noticed a familiar suspect. A rival watched from another table. The money supported a market for personal protection. Bodyguards, armoured vehicles, alarm systems, weapons and private security became common among people connected to the trade. A wealthy trafficker feared law enforcement, but he might fear kidnapping or robbery more. Criminals knew that his money could not be reported stolen. Professionals entered the surrounding economy. Lawyers represented defendants, created corporations, handled property purchases and advised clients about investigations. Most performed lawful work required by the justice system and commercial life. Others crossed the line by hiding ownership, transmitting instructions, moving assets, or helping witnesses avoid authorities. Accountants could design books that made a business appear profitable. Real estate agents could locate properties requiring minimal scrutiny. Bank employees could warn customers about reporting requirements. Public officials could accelerate permits or provide information. One compromised professional was more useful than several armed smugglers because that person could make an illegal operation look ordinary. Corruption did not require an entire institution to be controlled. A trafficker needed one clerk willing to reveal a record, one police officer willing to provide a warning, or one bank employee willing to ignore a deposit. Large organizations used money carefully, identifying the point where a payment could remove a problem. Miami's reputation began to affect legitimate business. National reports described the city as a center of drugs, violence, refugee crises, and underground finance. Some visitors and companies became cautious. Local business leaders worried that fear would damage tourism and investment. At the same time, parts of the economy remained active during a period of national recession and high interest rates. Cash buyers did not depend on expensive loans. International investors continued moving capital into South Florida. Construction and luxury spending made the city appear prosperous even while its institutions were under severe pressure. This produced an uncomfortable dependency. Aggressive financial enforcement could protect the city from criminal influence, but it could also remove money that had been supporting sales, property values, deposits, and jobs. A business owner did not have to approve of cocaine trafficking to worry about what would happen if wealthy customers disappeared. Operation Greenback began changing the behavior of banks. Currency transactions received more attention. Deposits that once passed without serious examination created reports and investigations. Financial employees understood that accepting cash could bring federal agents into the institution. Traffickers adapted. They divided deposits into smaller amounts, used more intermediaries, purchased monetary instruments, moved funds through offshore centers, and relied on professional laundering organizations. When Miami banks became dangerous, money could be routed through Panama, the Bahamas, Colombia, and other jurisdictions. Some organizations stopped trying to place every dollar into the banking system. Cash was buried, hidden in walls, stored in warehouses, packed into vehicles, and flown abroad. Federal agents later found millions concealed in ceiling compartments and safe houses. The FBI's Miami office recovered more than $3.8 million from false spaces in a stash house during a 1987 investigation of the Benitez organization. FBI.gov. Every hiding place revealed the same problem. The traffickers had produced more money than they could use safely. Their wealth was evidence of success and a source of vulnerability. By the middle of the 1980s, law enforcement had better methods for attacking that vulnerability. Financial investigations improved, asset forfeiture expanded, money laundering became a federal crime in 1986. Banks became less willing to accept unexplained truckloads of currency. The cocaine organizations did not disappear. They changed their routes, institutions, and methods. Miami's role as an open financial entrance for drug cash became harder to maintain, and parts of the laundering business shifted abroad. The buildings remained. So did the banks, roads, companies, careers, and habits of international finance that had grown during the period. It was no longer possible to separate every lawful dollar from every illegal one. The money had passed through too many hands and entered too many transactions. Miami had not been built by cocaine, but cocaine had accelerated parts of its transformation. It had increased the amount of cash available, rewarded rapid development, strengthened certain international financial connections, and taught criminal organizations how to operate behind legitimate companies. It had also left the city with higher prices, corruption cases, damaged institutions, and a public reputation tied to violence. The same money that helped fill office buildings had paid the gunmen who filled homicide files. The same boats that appeared at marinas carried cargo that produced funerals. As federal agents began seizing accounts and dismantling financial networks, the streets slowly changed. The most reckless gunmen were killed, arrested, or replaced. The larger Colombian organizations moved toward different routes and more controlled methods. Miami would eventually report fewer drug-related murders, but the end of the loudest violence did not erase what had happened. The city still had to account for the people who survived it, the neighborhoods that carried the costs, and the institutions that had learned to live beside criminal wealth. That reckoning began after the gunfire became less frequent, when residents could finally look at the skyline, the court records, and the names of the dead and ask what the cocaine years had actually left behind. The cocaine wars did not end on a single afternoon. There was no final shootout after which Miami returned to normal, no announcement that the last smuggler had left, and no clear date when residents could stop expecting the next public execution. The violence declined unevenly. Some gunmen were killed, others were arrested, became informants, or moved away. Smuggling routes changed. Financial investigations improved. The largest organizations became more careful, and the least disciplined crews destroyed themselves. Miami's recovery was gradual because the conditions that produced the crisis had become part of the city's economy, government, courts, police departments, and international identity. The scale of the damage was easier to measure than the beginning of the recovery. Dade County recorded 569 homicides in 1980, a rate of about 35 victims per 100,000 residents. A later account placed the county's high point at 621 homicides in 1981. Researchers studying the period found that almost 1/4 of homicides between 1978 and 1982 were drug-related, and that the county experienced a 60% increase in killings during those 5 years. The drug cases included executions, robberies of cocaine shipments, arguments over distribution, unpaid debts, and murders of suspected informants. They existed alongside domestic killings, robberies, racial conflict, and other forms of violence, which is why the era cannot be explained by cocaine alone. The statistics affected daily work inside public institutions. Homicide detectives carried more cases than they could investigate quickly. Medical examiners processed victims whose names, immigration histories, and criminal connections were not always immediately known. Prosecutors relied on witnesses who were frightened, compromised, or involved in the same organizations as the defendants. Courts handled narcotics conspiracies that crossed several countries and included defendants using aliases, false documents, and hidden financial ownership. Ordinary residents did not experience the crisis as a set of annual totals. They experienced it through local television reports, newspaper photographs, helicopters, police tape, and rumours about the people living nearby. A murder at a shopping centre changed the way people viewed public places. An abandoned car could attract attention because it might contain a body. A neighbour who appeared suddenly wealthy became the subject of private speculation. Parents warned children to stay away from strangers, parked vehicles and houses where unfamiliar men arrived at night. Fear also damaged Miami's national image. The city was discussed as a place of cocaine, refugees, riots, corruption, and murder. These subjects had different causes, but they were often combined into one story by people outside South Florida. The Mariel boat lift was treated as evidence of criminal disorder, even though the overwhelming majority of arrivals were not criminals. Black neighborhoods protesting police violence were reduced to images of burning buildings. Colombian and Cuban communities were described through the actions of traffickers who represented only a small part of either population. Local business leaders understood that the reputation could become economically dangerous. Tourism depended on visitors believing they could move through the city safely. Companies considering relocation did not want employees frightened by national reports. Families with money and mobility could leave for Broward County, Palm Beach County, or another state. In a 1981 survey cited by Vice President George H.W. Bush, 39% of respondents said they were seriously considering leaving the area because of crime and drugs. When the survey was repeated 2 years later, the figure had fallen to 9%. The administration used that decline as evidence that the federal response had improved public confidence, although a change in opinion did not mean the trafficking networks had disappeared. The federal response took a more organised form on January 28, 1982, when President Ronald Reagan announced a special anti-crime task force for South Florida under Vice President Bush. The decision followed pressure from local officials and residents who believed the region's police, courts, and federal offices were being overwhelmed. Reagan's announcement described South Florida as the country's major terminal for illegal drug smuggling and promised temporary federal help to restore public safety. The task force brought agencies together that had previously worked with different priorities and chains of command. The DEA investigated trafficking organizations. Customs officers watched ports, airports, and borders. The Coast Guard intercepted vessels. The FBI handled organized crime, corruption, and other federal offenses. The IRS traced income and financial records. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms worked weapons cases. Federal prosecutors, judges, military radar systems, aircraft, and naval resources were added to the effort. The structure did not remove bureaucratic rivalry, but it created a place where agencies were expected to share intelligence and plan operations together. The work remained dangerous. On December 2nd, 1982, ATF Special Agent Ariel Rios and his partner, Alex Diatri, met suspects at the Hurricane Motel in Miami during an undercover operation involving cocaine and machine guns. One suspect became suspicious and a gunfight followed. Rios was killed. Diatri and both suspects were wounded. Rios's death showed that the task force was not operating from a distant command centre. Agents were entering motel rooms and parking lots to negotiate with armed traffickers who expected betrayal. By June 1983, Bush reported that cocaine seizures in South Florida had risen by 54% and that authorities had seized more than 17,000 pounds of cocaine during the previous 15 months. Those were administration figures presented to defend the program, and they measured enforcement activity rather than the total amount entering the country. Bush also acknowledged that pressure in South Florida was pushing smugglers toward the Atlantic coast, the Gulf of Mexico, the Mexican border, and California. The task force could disrupt a route without eliminating the market that made the route profitable. That displacement was one of the most important results. Direct flights and speedboat runs into South Florida became more dangerous as radar, Coast Guard patrols, and interagency intelligence improved. Traffickers responded by using commercial cargo, container ships, longer routes, and other American entry points. Some cocaine moved through Mexico before crossing the land border. Other shipments continued through Caribbean islands, but used different vessels and transfer methods. Enforcement did not produce a simple decline from success to victory. It forced the business to become more geographically diverse and technically sophisticated. The federal government tried to apply the South Florida model elsewhere. In 1983, the National Narcotics Border Interdiction System expanded regional coordination beyond Miami, while the organized crime drug enforcement task forces pursued major trafficking and money laundering organizations through prosecutor-led, multi-agency investigations. The FBI also received authority in 1983 to investigate drug matters jointly with the DEA, increasing the number of agencies able to pursue the organizations behind individual shipments. The change became visible in later Miami cases. In 1987, FBI agents seized a 46-foot yacht carrying 613 kilograms of cocaine. That year they also found more than $3.8 million hidden above false closet ceilings in a stash house used by the Benitez organization. In 1988, the Travesura investigation led to 13 convictions and the forfeiture of money and property, including a 400-foot freighter used to import an estimated 4,000 kilograms of cocaine. These cases showed that investigators were increasingly targeting transportation, cash, property, and organizational leadership together. Money had become the point at which the traffickers were most exposed. Earlier federal efforts had rarely taken enough property to damage a large organization. A 1980 Government Accountability Office review concluded that forfeitures amounted to little more than business expenses when compared with criminal profits, and a 1981 review found that asset forfeiture remained an underused tool in narcotics cases. Congress and the Justice Department responded by strengthening the legal and administrative system for seizing criminal property. The Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984 created the Justice Department's Assets Forfeiture Fund, allowing proceeds from forfeited property to support the costs of seizure, management, and certain law enforcement operations. The Money Laundering Control Act of 1986 made money laundering a federal crime, prohibited structuring transactions to evade currency reports, and expanded civil and criminal forfeiture connected to Bank Secrecy Act violations. These changes gave prosecutors clearer tools against the bankers, couriers, company owners, and financial managers who made drug proceeds appear legitimate. For traffickers, this meant that conviction could cost more than personal freedom. Houses, aircraft, boats, cars, accounts, and businesses could be frozen or taken. Lawyers had to argue about whether assets were criminal proceeds before those assets could be used to pay legal fees. Financial records that once seemed separate from a drug investigation became evidence of the organization itself. The new approach did not eliminate corruption. Cocaine profits had already shown police officers, public employees, and professionals how much money could be made by protecting a shipment or ignoring a crime. Miami's most damaging police scandal involved officers known as the River Cops. Members of the group were accused of using police authority to steal drugs and money, commit robberies, and participate in other serious crimes. Research into the department found that about 12% of officers hired between June 1980 and June 1983 were later fired, suspended, or convicted of criminal charges, reflecting failures in recruitment, screening, supervision, and discipline during a period of rapid expansion. The scandal injured more than the reputation of the officers involved. Every corrupt officer created doubt about honest arrests. Traffickers could claim that evidence had been stolen or planted. Witnesses had another reason not to trust police. Honest officers worked beside colleagues who might sell information, protect a drug load, or target criminals for robbery. Rebuilding the department required stronger background checks, internal investigations, training, supervision, and a willingness to investigate police conduct publicly. Corruption also explained why the cocaine organization survived arrests that appeared decisive. A leader could be jailed while associates continued moving drugs. A fugitive could obtain false identification, rent luxury property, and receive warnings. Court employees, jurors, lawyers, or witnesses could be pressured or bribed. The organizations understood that influencing one person inside a system might be cheaper than confronting the whole system. The Falcon Magaluta organization illustrated how long a Miami network could continue after the first violent peak. Federal records describe Augusto Willie Falcon and Salvador Magaluta as two of South Florida's most prolific traffickers. Ledgers seized from a residence controlled by Magaluta recorded the distribution of 8,921 kilograms of cocaine worth more than $142 million between January 1990 and October 1991. A federal indictment was returned in April 1991, and Magaluta was captured that October. The case showed that the city's cocaine economy remained enormous long after the Dublin shooting and the creation of the task force. Colombian organizations also remained active. Men acting under Pablo Escobar's direction held South Florida businesses and property, supported cocaine imports, and moved proceeds back to Colombia from 1979 into the 1990s. Escobar's death in December 1993 weakened the Medellin organization, but it did not end Colombian cocaine exports. The Cali cartel expanded and adopted methods that depended less on public gunmen and more on commercial concealment, intelligence, corruption, and financial management. One Miami case demonstrated the change in method. Between 1988 and 1991, Cali cartel traffickers imported cocaine hidden inside asphalt drums and concrete posts. In 1991, customs inspectors found metal sleeves containing more than 12,000 kilograms of cocaine inside concrete cargo arriving through the port of Miami. The investigation eventually produced more than 100 convictions connected to the cartel. The shipment did not resemble the improvised speedboat operations of the late 1970s. It used shipping documents, containers, warehouses, port access, and apparently legitimate building materials. This was one reason the city appeared calmer while the trade continued. A container filled with concealed cocaine did not create the same visible spectacle as gunmen firing inside a mall. A financial manager using international transfers attracted less public attention than a trafficker driving an armoured Mercedes. The organisations had learned that secrecy protected profit better than a reputation for uncontrolled violence. Homicide rates eased from the extraordinary levels reached around 1980 and 1981, although crime remained high. A Dade County review covering 1979 through 1985 found a slight decline in violent crime rates after 1980, even as property crime continued to rise and some offences reached new records. The decline cannot be assigned to one agency or policy. Federal pressure, local investigations, the deaths and arrests of gunmen, changing routes, and shifts within the trafficking market all contributed. The people affected by the earlier killings did not experience that statistical improvement as closure. Children had watched parents die. Families received bodies from crimes they did not understand. Witnesses relocated or remained silent for years. Detectives carried unsolved files after suspects were murdered, deported or imprisoned under other names. Miami-Dade still maintains records of unresolved homicides from the 1980s, reminders that the end of a crime wave does not solve every crime committed during it. Neighbourhoods carried different parts of the cost. Families connected to traffickers feared retaliation and law enforcement at the same time. Black communities already facing unemployment, underinvestment and distrust of police or resources directed toward enforcement without equal solutions to their underlying problems. Immigrant communities had to defend themselves against the assumption that nationality implied criminal involvement. Legitimate Colombian and Cuban business owners could be treated with suspicion because criminals had used the same languages, travel routes, and commercial connections. Another change reached the streets as powder cocaine was converted into crack and sold in lower-cost units. Research found that crack had reached Miami by 1981 and was already known among some young users before national media coverage began focusing heavily on it in 1985. By the middle of the decade, the local cocaine market was affecting younger users, street-level sellers, and poorer neighbourhoods in ways that differed from the earlier wholesale trade. The glamorous image associated with private parties, expensive clubs, and wealthy users became harder to sustain when addiction and open-air retail markets caused visible damage. Miami's cocaine story did not end when the Cowboys disappeared from the front pages. It changed social class and location. The same international supply chain that had enriched wholesalers could supply small neighbourhood dealers. A business that once involved aircraft, yachts, and kilogram transactions now reached streets where purchases were measured in rocks and individual doses. Popular culture responded before the history was settled. Miami Vice premiered in 1984 and ran for 5 seasons. Its detectives chased traffickers through a city presented in pastel colours, modern buildings, nightclubs, sports cars, marinas, and decaying hotels. Local tourism officials initially worried that another crime story would deepen Miami's damaged reputation. The program instead helped transform the city's image, making its danger appear stylish and attracting attention to South Beach and its Art Deco architecture. That television version had a complicated effect. It did not deny violence, but it placed violence beside fashion, music, speedboats, and expensive cars. The city's real crisis became an exportable style. Viewers could enjoy the appearance of cocaine wealth without seeing the counting rooms, frightened children, unidentified bodies, overloaded detectives, or relatives waiting for a murder case to move forward. Miami also began to resemble the image being sold. Art Deco preservation had started before the television series, but exposure helped South Beach attract fashion shoots, restaurants, boutiques, visitors, and investment. Buildings once associated with decline became internationally recognizable. A program inspired partly by Miami's crisis contributed to the city's recovery from the reputation created by that crisis. The process encouraged selective memory. The sports cars remained interesting. The clothing returned as nostalgia. The speedboats became entertainment. Stories about Griselda Blanco, Pablo Escobar, and Miami smugglers were adapted into films, documentaries, television dramas, books, and tours. The victims usually received less attention because they did not leave large estates, recorded interviews, or dramatic nicknames. Even the phrase cocaine cowboys simplified the record. It described the reckless gunmen who frightened Miami, but it could hide the quieter people who made the trade possible. Pilots, bankers, accountants, attorneys, police officers, dock workers, real estate buyers, couriers, mechanics, and legitimate businesses all appeared somewhere around the movement of drugs and money. Some participated knowingly, others encountered the economy without understanding it. The complete system was larger than the men carrying submachine guns. The city that emerged from the period was more experienced in international finance, federal prosecution, interagency policing, asset forfeiture, and narcotics investigation. South Florida became a permanent center for agencies dealing with the Caribbean and Latin America. Task forces that appeared exceptional in 1982 became normal tools for addressing organizations that crossed jurisdictions. Miami did not stop being a cocaine gateway. Justice Department assessments decades later continued to identify South Florida as a major destination and distribution center supplied through Caribbean routes, commercial cargo, aircraft, vehicles, and partnerships among Colombian and other trafficking groups. The methods changed repeatedly, but the geographic advantages remained. International airports, a major port, extensive coastline, a large financial sector, and close commercial connections with Latin America and the Caribbean. What changed most was the visibility of the business. The late 1970s and early 1980s allowed traffickers to display wealth and use public violence before institutions adjusted. Later organizations had the benefit of that lesson. They knew that a mall shooting could unite agencies and frighten customers, bankers, politicians, and residents. They preferred concealed cargo, layered companies, secure communication, and hired specialists who did not appear beside the drugs. The law enforcement system learned a related lesson. Seizing cocaine was not enough. A lasting investigation had to identify the supplier, transporter, distributor, financial manager, corrupt official, property owner, and organization directing them. It had to protect witnesses, trace money across borders, and take assets that could finance the next shipment. Those practices developed partly because Miami showed the cost of allowing a trafficking economy to become established before attacking its full structure. The city recovered, but recovery did not mean erasure. Miami became wealthier, larger, and more internationally influential. South Beach regained visitors. Brickell expanded. New generations arrived with no personal memory of the Dadeland shooting or the homicide totals of 1980 and 1981. The evidence remained in court files, forfeited properties, cold case records, police reforms, and federal agencies built around the problems exposed during those years. It remained in families that knew why a relative had disappeared, and families that never learned. It remained in the public habit of connecting Miami with cocaine, even after the city had developed many other identities. The cocaine years did not create modern Miami, and ending the most visible violence did not end the cocaine trade. They changed how the city was policed, financed, represented, and understood. A route that began in Andean coca fields reached far beyond a package unloaded from a boat. It entered banks, houses, courtrooms, police departments, television screens, and the physical growth of the city. That is the lasting history behind the familiar images. The expensive cars were real, but so were the unpaid debts. The waterfront houses were real, but so were the stash rooms. The skyline grew while detectives continued opening homicide files. Miami moved forward because cities do not have the option of remaining inside their worst years, but the city that moved forward was not the same one that had entered them.